My mother stared right through me, her voice cold as ice when she called me a parasite. She said it with such absolute disgust, like I was a disease she could no longer tolerate. Minutes later, I stood frozen in the hallway, pressing my ear against the heavy oak door of my late father's study. I listened to her casually plotting with my brothers, slicing up my entire inheritance and leaving me with nothing. Every single word they said felt like a knife to my chest. They were so incredibly confident. They thought I was just a quiet, obedient daughter who would take the abuse and never fight back. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They had no idea I had already found the exact weapon I needed to destroy them completely. My name is Harper. I am 31 years old, and I work as a senior tax auditor. The nightmare officially started on a cold Tuesday evening, right in the middle of a vicious argument in my mother Cynthia's pristine living room. The air in the house was thick with tension. Without warning, she snatched a crumpled medical bill from the glass coffee table and hurled it directly at my face. The heavy paper smacked against my cheek and fluttered down to the hardwood floor. She crossed her arms, her expensive designer silk blouse catching the chandelier light, and sneered at me. "You are a parasite, Harper. A selfish, miserable little parasite who only takes and takes." I stood there, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth actually ached. A parasite. That was the exact word she chose. Just 3 hours earlier, I had completely drained my own emergency savings account to pay her $12,000 property tax bill so she would not lose this ridiculous suburban mansion. I paid for her groceries. I paid for her luxury car insurance. I even paid for the very silk blouse she was wearing. Yet here she was glaring at me like I was the dirt beneath her shoes. I bit my tongue. I knew arguing with Cynthia was like screaming into a raging hurricane. I bent down, picked up my purse, and turned my back on her without saying a single word. I needed to get out of that toxic house before I lost my mind. I walked quietly down the long carpeted hallway toward the front door. But as I passed my late father's study, a sudden sound stopped me dead in my tracks. It was the muffled sound of familiar laughter. My brother Julian was in there. Julian was 34, the golden child of the family, a supposed tech entrepreneur whose startup was constantly bleeding cash. I crept closer, the floorboards cold beneath my feet. The thick wooden door was cracked open just an inch. I held my breath, closed my eyes and leaned in to listen. My heart pounded against my ribs like a hammer. The things I heard in the next 60 seconds would change the course of my entire life and theirs forever. The heavy oak door swung open with enough force that the brass handle struck the drywall with a deafening crack. The loud noise instantly shattered the sickeningly cheerful atmosphere inside my late father's study. The large room smelled heavily of expensive aged bourbon and old leather. My brother Julian was leaning casually against the mahogany bookshelf holding a crystal glass of amber liquid. My mother Cynthia sat perfectly poised behind the massive executive desk like a queen on a stolen throne. They were clinking their glasses together. They were actually celebrating. A bottle of vintage champagne sat half empty in a silver bucket near the window. The sheer audacity of the scene made my stomach violently churn. They both froze and looked at me. Julian had the absolute nerve to smirk while taking a slow, deliberate sip of his drink. Cynthia did not even flinch. She simply set her crystal flute down on a leather coaster and intertwined her perfectly manicured fingers, resting them on the polished wood. She looked at me with the bored expression of someone mildly annoyed by a stray dog wandering into a pristine garden. I stepped fully into the room and let the door click shut behind me. My hands were shaking so violently from the adrenaline that I had to ball them into tight fists at my sides just to maintain my composure. I demanded to know exactly what they were talking about. My voice trembled for a fraction of a second at first, but then the raw burning anger took over and anchored it deeply. I asked them to explain to me right now what they meant by dividing my inheritance. I brought up my father. I reminded them of the trust fund he had set up before his heart failed. $4.5 million. That money was meant to be split evenly between his children. It was his dying wish to ensure we both had security and stability. I looked directly into my mother's cold blue eyes and demanded to know how she could possibly sit there and plot to give every single penny to a 34-year-old man who had never worked a hard day in his entire life. Julian scoffed and rolled his eyes dramatically toward the ceiling. He adjusted the expensive cuffs of his designer suit and muttered that I was always so intensely dramatic and completely out of touch with reality. He told me that his tech startup desperately needed capital and that family resources were meant to be utilized for aggressive business growth, not sitting stagnant in a bank account. I ignored him entirely. My eyes remained locked intensely on Cynthia. I asked her again how she could legally bypass the strict trust structure. As a senior tax auditor, I knew the financial laws intimately. I knew the rigorous legal bindings of a state-verified trust fund. You cannot simply erase a primary beneficiary just because you heavily prefer your golden child son over your hardworking daughter. Cynthia let out a soft, chilling sigh of exasperation. She reached slowly into the top right drawer of the mahogany desk, the exact same desk where my father used to sit, and patiently helped me with my math homework when I was a little girl. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored folder and opened it with agonizing slowness. She extracted a single sheet of heavy legal paper and placed it perfectly flat on the polished wood. With one perfectly manicured finger, she slid the document across the massive desk until it stopped right at the edge, directly in front of me. She told me in a voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth that nobody was bypassing anything. She stated calmly that the transition of the trust funds was completely legal and fully documented. She suggested I read it for myself if my professional auditing skills were as sharp as I constantly bragged they were. I stepped forward and looked down at the paper. The bold black text at the top read, "Waiver and release of inheritance rights." My eyes quickly scanned the dense legal jargon. It explicitly stated that I voluntarily relinquished any and all claims to the $4.5 million trust fund, effectively transferring my entire financial share directly to the secondary beneficiary, Julian. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I skipped to the bottom of the page. Right there above the printed line with my full legal name was my signature. I stared intensely at the blue ink. It was a flawless replication. The slight loop on the H, the sharp angle of the P, the trailing tail of the R. It was my exact signature, but I had never seen this document in my entire life. I had never signed it. I leaned closer, feeling a sudden wave of profound nausea wash over me. Then I saw the stamp. Directly beside my forged signature was the raised embossed seal of a state-certified notary public. It was dated just 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, I was busy working 14-hour shifts at my accounting firm while simultaneously managing the massive property tax payments for the very house we were currently standing in. I looked up from the paper. Julian was grinning broadly now, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Cynthia picked up her champagne flute and took a delicate celebratory sip. I told them this was a forgery. I said the word loud and clear so there was no misunderstanding. Forgery. I pointed a shaking finger at the document and declared that I never signed away my legal rights and that this was a blatant criminal act. I told them I was going to call the police right now. I reached into my winter coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I threatened to have them both arrested for fraud and criminal conspiracy. I told them the authorities would trace the document, investigate the notary, and uncover exactly what they had done to me. Cynthia actually laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or a defensive chuckle. It was a deep, genuine sound of pure, arrogant amusement. She leaned back in my father's leather chair and rested her chin on her hand. She asked me in a mocking, condescending tone who exactly I thought the police were going to believe. She gestured casually toward the document on the desk. She reminded me that the paper possessed a legally binding state-certified notary seal. She explained patiently, like she was speaking to a toddler, that the state legally recognizes the notary as an impartial official witness to the signing. She tilted her head and smiled a terrifying, predatory smile. She painted a vivid picture for me. She said the police would arrive and see a wealthy, respectable, grieving widow and a highly successful tech entrepreneur. Then they would look at me, a bitter, jealous, disgruntled sister who was furious that her family decided to invest in her brother's brilliant future instead of handing her a pile of unearned cash. She said the police deal with greedy, angry relatives fighting over inheritance money every single day of the week. She assured me they would take one look at that officially notarized document, tell me it was a civil family matter, and laugh me right out of the police precinct. She was weaponizing the legal system against me. The absolute terrifying reality of her words crashed down on me like a heavy concrete block. As an auditor, I knew the immense legal power of a notarized signature. To prove a forgery of this high caliber would require thousands of dollars in immediate legal fees, independent forensic handwriting analysts, and years tied up in grueling civil litigation. And my mother knew I had just drained my entire emergency savings account yesterday to pay her overdue property taxes. I was completely broke. I had zero liquid cash for a lawyer retainer. She had engineered this trap perfectly. She had drained my cash to ensure I could not fight back in court when she stole my financial future. Julian walked over and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. His physical touch made my skin crawl with disgust. He leaned in close and whispered that it was time for me to leave. He said I was ruining the celebratory vibe of the evening. I violently shoved his hand away, stepping back. The sheer intense hatred I felt in that moment was completely overwhelming. I looked at the two people who were supposed to be my family. They were strangers. They were ruthless financial predators who had spent years feeding off my strong sense of duty and familial guilt. Cynthia stood up and pointed a commanding finger toward the heavy oak door. She told me to pack whatever cheap clothes I had upstairs and get out of her house immediately. She stated coldly that my presence was no longer required or welcome in her home. She warned me that if I was not completely gone in 15 minutes, she would have Julian physically throw me out onto the street, and she would personally call the police to report a hostile trespasser. I did not scream. I did not cry. The initial shock and betrayal was rapidly solidifying into a cold, dark block of pure, absolute resolve deep inside my chest. I turned around and walked out of the study without another word. I marched up the sweeping wooden staircase to my old bedroom. I grabbed a small canvas duffel bag and shoved only my absolute essentials inside. My laptop, my professional tax auditing files, my heavy winter coats, and a few basic changes of clothes. I purposefully left behind anything they had ever bought me. I wanted absolutely nothing that tied me to them financially or emotionally. 15 minutes later, I walked out the heavy front doors of the sprawling suburban mansion. The weather outside perfectly matched the absolute bleakness of my current reality. A massive, brutal winter storm had just rolled into Chicago. The freezing wind howled through the bare trees, and icy sleet whipped aggressively against my face. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind me with a loud, definitive thud, echoing the harsh finality of my eviction. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly into place, locking me out of my childhood home forever. I dragged my duffel bag down the long paved driveway. The freezing rain soaked quickly through my wool coat, chilling me to the absolute bone. I finally reached my modest sedan parked out on the dark street. I threw my bag onto the passenger seat and climbed behind the steering wheel. My hands were completely numb from the biting cold, but I gripped the leather steering wheel incredibly tightly. I sat there in the dark, freezing car, watching the warm golden lights glowing brightly from the windows of my father's study. I pictured them inside pouring more champagne, laughing at my expense, toasting to their brilliant, flawless crime. They believed they had won. They truly believed they had completely destroyed me and left me with absolutely no possible recourse. They thought my lack of immediate financial resources made me helpless, vulnerable, and weak. But they failed to realize one crucial fundamental detail. They had just declared a total financial war against a senior tax auditor. I knew exactly how to follow the money. I knew how to find the hidden ledgers, the buried debts, the forged applications, and the fatal structural flaws in any financial facade. They thought this eviction was the end of the story. As I started the engine and turned on the heater to thaw my freezing hands, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. This was not the end. This was the exact moment the real game began, and I was going to tear their entire world apart piece by piece. The temperature inside my modest sedan dropped rapidly as the brutal Chicago winter storm raged outside. I sat in the driver's seat with my knees pulled up to my chest, wrapped tightly in my heavy wool coat. The engine was off to save gas, and the silence of the dark street was only broken by the aggressive howling of the freezing wind and the sharp, rhythmic slapping of icy sleet against my windshield. Every single breath I took materialized as a thick white cloud in the freezing air. My hands were completely numb, but the physical pain of the bitter cold was absolutely nothing compared to the violent, agonizing twisting in my gut. I had just been evicted from the only home I had ever known, cast out into the freezing rain by the woman who gave birth to me. My mind replayed the image of that forged document over and over again, the flawless replication of my personal signature, the raised embossed seal of the state-certified notary public. They had stolen $4.5 million from me, with a single piece of paper and a manufactured lie. I spent the first 3 hours of that agonizing night just staring blindly at the frosted glass of my window, shivering uncontrollably. The sheer magnitude of their calculated betrayal felt like a crushing physical weight pressing heavily down on my chest, making it incredibly difficult to draw a full breath. I felt profoundly stupid and deeply humiliated. I had spent years desperately trying to earn Cynthia's love by sacrificing my own financial security. I had paid her property taxes. I had funded her lavish lifestyle, and she had looked me dead in the eye and called me a parasite while actively orchestrating the theft of my entire future. Sometime around 4 in the morning, the tears finally stopped falling. The deep, profound sorrow I felt slowly began to harden. It crystallized into something entirely different. It transformed into a cold, dark, and incredibly sharp rage. I was Harper. I was a 31-year-old senior tax auditor. I spent 60 hours a week dismantling complex financial fraud for a living. I tracked hidden assets through labyrinthine corporate structures. I found the lies that millionaires tried to bury in their tax returns. My mother and my brother thought they had outsmarted me because they held a piece of paper with a shiny gold seal. They thought I would just cry in my freezing car and eventually surrender to their fabricated reality. They were completely wrong. I reached over to the passenger seat and grabbed my canvas duffel bag. My fingers were stiff and clumsy from the freezing cold, but I managed to pull out my professional laptop. I started the car engine and blasted the heater, directing the warm air entirely onto my frozen hands until the painful stinging sensation subsided enough for me to type accurately. I connected my computer to my cell phone mobile hotspot. The glowing screen illuminated the dark, freezing interior of my car, casting harsh shadows across the dashboard. I took a slow, deep breath and deliberately pushed all my chaotic emotional pain into a tight, locked box in the back of my mind. I needed absolute total clarity. I could no longer think like a betrayed daughter or a heartbroken sister. I had to think exactly like a forensic auditor facing a highly hostile entity. The investigation officially began the moment my secure web browser opened. I started with the only piece of tangible evidence I had seen on that mahogany desk: the notary seal. In the state of Illinois, a notary public is a commissioned official, and their commissioning records are completely public information if you know exactly which government database to query. When I had scanned the forged waiver of inheritance, my trained eyes had instinctively memorized the specific commission number and the expiration date stamped beneath the embossed seal. It was a professional reflex I had developed over years of scrutinizing thousands of legal financial documents. I navigated directly to the Illinois Secretary of State official portal. I bypassed the standard public search index and logged into the advanced professional directory using my corporate auditing credentials. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the rapid clicking sound filling the quiet car. I typed in the exact commission number and hit enter. The state database churned for 3 seconds before displaying the official record. The notary was a man named Gregory Vance. The commission was currently active and registered to a commercial address in downtown Chicago. I recognized the address immediately. It was a shared corporate workspace building frequently used by desperate tech startups trying to look prestigious on a tight budget. It was the exact same building where Julian rented the office space for his failing company. A bitter, humorless smile crossed my face. Julian was incredibly arrogant, but he was also fundamentally lazy. He did not go out and find a corrupt criminal mastermind to forge a state document. He used someone inside his own pathetic bubble. I opened a new secure tab and ran a comprehensive background search on Gregory Vance using an aggregated data broker service my firm utilized for initial client screenings. I pulled up his education history, his previous residential addresses, his social media footprint, and his known associates. Within 15 minutes, the digital puzzle pieces snapped perfectly into place. Gregory Vance had attended the exact same university as my brother Julian. They had graduated in the exact same year. I dug deeper, pulling up archived university records and Greek life directories. There it was in stark black and white. Gregory Vance and Julian were fraternity brothers. They had lived in the exact same chapter house for 3 consecutive years. They were old drinking buddies. Julian had simply called in a massive illegal favor from an old college friend who possessed a notary stamp and lacked a basic moral compass. My brother had handed over $4.5 million of my money using a guy he used to play beer pong with. The sheer sloppy audacity of it made my blood boil all over again. Now I had the clear connection. I had the obvious financial motive. I had the digital proof of a pre-existing relationship between the primary beneficiary of the forged document and the state official who illegally notarized it. A naive person would immediately drive to the nearest police station or hire a civil litigation attorney first thing in the morning. But I was not naive. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, the heater of my car, finally making the cabin bearable. I began to map out the exact trajectory of a standard legal battle in my head, analyzing all the variables. If I filed a civil lawsuit against Cynthia and Julian to contest the validity of the inheritance waiver, I would immediately trigger a massive defensive war of attrition. The burden of proof would rest entirely on my shoulders. I would have to hire an elite legal team to take on my wealthy family. I would have to pay non-refundable retainer fees upward of $50,000 just to get the case on the civil court docket. I would have to hire multiple independent forensic handwriting analysts to testify under oath that the signature was faked. I would have to subpoena Gregory Vance and depose him, which would give him ample time to align his story with Julian. The entire grueling process would take a minimum of 3 to 5 years to wind its way through the heavily backlogged probate courts. And the most sickening, terrifying part of this entire scenario was the funding mechanism. Because my name had been officially removed from the trust, by that forged document, Cynthia and Julian currently had full unrestricted access to the $4.5 million. If I sued them, they would simply use my own stolen money to hire the most ruthless, expensive defense attorneys in the state of Illinois. They would use my own inheritance to bury me in endless legal motions, procedural delays, and aggressive countersuits. They would drag the case out for years, knowing perfectly well that I was completely broke, having just drained my personal savings to pay their property taxes. I would eventually run out of money to pay my own lawyers, and the judge would dismiss the case due to lack of funds to proceed. They had engineered a legal situation where fighting them fairly through the standard justice system was a guaranteed financial suicide mission. The law is a slow grinding machine, and it almost always favors the party holding the most liquid cash. Right now, they held all the cash, my cash. I leaned my head back against the headrest of my car seat and closed my eyes. The pale gray light of the early morning was just beginning to break over the frozen Chicago skyline, revealing the harsh concrete of the city. The streetlights flickered off, casting a cold, harsh reality over my desperate situation. A defensive legal strategy would completely destroy me. Trying to prove the document was fake in a standard courtroom would drain my soul and leave me entirely bankrupt while they lived luxuriously on my father's hard-earned wealth. If I wanted to win this war, I could not play by the standard rules of civil litigation. I could not attack the legal shield they had so carefully built around the trust fund. I had to completely bypass it and detonate a bomb directly inside their financial fortress. To truly defeat Cynthia and Julian, I did not just need to prove the signature was a forgery. I needed to absolutely annihilate their cash flow. I needed to cut off their access to the money so violently and so suddenly that they would have no resources left to defend themselves. I needed to orchestrate a financial collapse so devastating that the federal government would step in and freeze every single asset they touched before they even realized what was happening. I opened my eyes and looked back at my bright laptop screen. Julian was currently running a tech startup, a startup that I knew for a fact was burning through cash at an incredibly alarming rate. He was using my stolen trust fund to artificially inflate his failing business and maintain his fake image of success. When a desperate, arrogant man starts bleeding money, he almost always starts cutting serious legal corners. He starts cooking the corporate books. He starts lying to his private investors. And most importantly, he starts lying to the Internal Revenue Service. If there was one thing I knew how to do better than anyone else in this city, it was finding the rotting hidden core of a fraudulent financial structure. I was going to audit my own brother. I was going to tear his entire financial life apart, transaction by transaction, ledger by ledger, until I found the exact thread that would unravel his entire fake empire. I was not going to hire a civil lawyer to sue him for my inheritance. I was going to hand him over to the federal authorities in handcuffs for corporate fraud. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp and echoing in the quiet car. I opened a secure encrypted browser and navigated directly to the public access portal for corporate tax filings and federal loan registries. I typed in the registered business name of Julian's company. I took one last deep breath of the cold air. The hunt had officially begun. I drove my modest sedan away from the dark, wealthy suburban street and headed straight for a 24-hour diner situated on the industrial edge of the city limits. I desperately needed a safe, quiet place with black coffee and a stable, high-speed internet connection. The small brass bell above the heavy glass door chimed loudly as I walked into the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the restaurant. The place was entirely empty, except for a tired-looking waitress wiping down a sticky counter. I slid into a cracked red vinyl booth, tucked far away in the back corner facing the main entrance. The waitress walked over silently, poured a thick ceramic mug of steaming black coffee, and left me completely alone without asking a single question. I reached into my canvas duffel bag and pulled out my professional auditing laptop. The bright screen flared to life, instantly illuminating the dark shadowed corner of the booth. I wrapped both of my freezing hands tightly around the hot ceramic mug, letting the intense heat slowly bring the feeling back to my completely numb fingers. I took a slow, deep breath and deliberately locked away the crushing emotional pain of my own mother, throwing me out into the freezing winter storm. I was no longer the discarded, unwanted daughter. I was a senior tax auditor, and I was officially hunting my prey. I immediately connected my laptop to my secure encrypted mobile hotspot. I opened my specialized web browser and navigated directly to the public access portal for state corporate tax filings. Because my brother Julian had aggressively marketed his tech startup to wealthy private investors, he had formally incorporated the business to legally issue shares. He constantly bragged about his brilliant corporate strategy and how he used Delaware shell companies to completely hide his financial footprint. But Julian was incredibly arrogant and fundamentally lazy. He had carelessly registered his primary operational business licenses and his state payroll taxes right here in the state of Illinois. As a senior auditor, I knew exactly how to exploit that massive oversight. His annual financial disclosures were subject to state public record if you knew the exact corporate identification numbers to query. I typed his ridiculous company name into the search bar. Global Tech Innovations. I hit enter, and the secure system immediately populated his official corporate tax returns and balance sheets for the past 3 fiscal years. I began downloading the raw financial data directly into a massive blank spreadsheet. To the average untrained eye, a comprehensive corporate tax return is just a chaotic, intimidating blur of random numbers and dense legal jargon. To me, it was a very clear and highly detailed narrative story. And the specific story Julian was telling the federal government was a complete, unmitigated disaster. At every single family dinner, Julian would loudly boast about his massive user acquisition metrics and his upcoming lucrative public offering. He wore custom-tailored suits and drove a $100,000 imported luxury car. But the raw financial data displayed on my bright screen told a completely different and utterly terrifying truth. His actual gross revenue from real paying customers was virtually non-existent. It was barely enough to cover his monthly commercial internet bill. Meanwhile, his operating expenses were astronomically high. He was aggressively burning through available capital at a completely unsustainable rate just to maintain the outward illusion of a highly successful functioning company. He was leasing premium penthouse office space in the most expensive commercial district of downtown Chicago. He was officially paying himself a massive unearned 6-figure executive salary directly from the company coffers. He was shamelessly expensing luxury car leases, lavish corporate dinners at 5-star restaurants, and incredibly expensive weekend retreats under the thin guise of business development. The absolute bottom line of his balance sheet was aggressively bleeding red ink. By the end of the previous fiscal quarter, his pathetic tech startup was officially $4.2 million in debt. He was completely financially underwater. His entire company was nothing more than a hollow, pathetic shell game, teetering on the absolute brink of total, catastrophic bankruptcy. I took a long, deliberate sip of the bitter, scalding black coffee. The heavy dose of caffeine hit my bloodstream rapidly, sharpening my intense focus even further. I continued scrolling through the dense rows of financial data when my eyes suddenly locked onto a massive glaring anomaly in his most recent quarterly filings. Just 6 weeks ago, right around the exact same time, my brother and my mother began quietly plotting to forge the documents to steal my $4.5 million trust fund. A sudden, massive injection of fresh capital appeared magically on his corporate balance sheet. It was exactly $2 million in liquid cash. The specific transaction was clearly and explicitly coded in the ledger as a secured commercial banking loan from a major national financial institution. My professional auditing instincts instantly flared red with absolute certainty. A reputable, highly regulated national commercial bank does not simply hand $2 million in liquid cash to a failing tech startup with zero actual revenue and over $4 million in existing debt. That kind of incredibly reckless, unsecured lending simply does not exist in the real financial world. To legally secure a commercial loan of that massive magnitude, the banking institution strictly requires ironclad, tangible collateral. They strongly demand hard physical assets of equal or greater value to legally secure the loan in the event of a total default. I needed to know exactly what Julian had used to secure that massive financial lifeline. My immediate and entirely logical assumption was that he had somehow manipulated my mother into using her sprawling suburban mansion. Cynthia constantly loved to brag to her wealthy friends about her pristine, expensive property, and I knew for an absolute fact the primary mortgage was fully paid off. But when I quickly accessed the current county property tax records for her specific residential address, there were absolutely no active liens or financial encumbrances listed whatsoever. Her massive house was completely financially clear. I frowned deeply, staring hard at the glowing laptop screen. If Julian did not use our mother's expensive house, then what on earth could he possibly offer a serious national bank as collateral? He owned absolutely nothing of real tangible value himself. Every single material thing he possessed was either leased, rented, or heavily financed. I opened a brand new secure browser tab and immediately accessed the Uniform Commercial Code Registry. This is the official federal database where national commercial lenders legally record their specific claims against a corporate borrower's pledged collateral. I typed in his company name and cross-referenced it directly with the specific banking institution listed on his recent tax filings. The government server spun slowly for a few agonizing seconds before finally spitting out the official filed document. I clicked the download button and held my breath as the scanned digital document loaded fully onto my bright screen. I rapidly scrolled down past the standard dense legal boilerplate directly to the specific schedule detailing the pledged collateral. The words printed clearly on the screen hit me like a violent physical punch directly to my chest. The collateral legally listed to secure the $2 million commercial loan was indeed real estate. But it was not just any random real estate. It was a highly specific portfolio of 3 incredibly lucrative commercial rental properties located directly in the upscale historic district of the city. I knew exactly who legally owned those specific properties. They belonged exclusively to my brilliant sister-in-law, Maya. Maya was an incredibly smart and fiercely independent African-American woman who had fought her way up from absolute poverty to become a top-tier corporate lawyer at a cutthroat, prestigious firm. She had meticulously purchased those 3 commercial properties several years before she ever even met my arrogant brother. They were her completely protected premarital assets. They represented her absolute financial security, her vital safety net, and the guaranteed future college education funds for her 2 beautiful young children. I leaned much closer to the screen, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I rapidly pulled up the final signature page of the binding loan agreement. There at the very bottom, right next to Julian's messy, arrogant scrawl, was Maya's distinct, beautiful, elegant signature. She was officially listed as the primary unconditional guarantor of the $2 million commercial loan. But I knew Maya intimately. I knew her meticulous, highly trained legal mind perfectly. She was a ruthless, sharp corporate litigator who specialized in dismantling complex contract law. There was absolutely zero chance she would ever legally pledge her hard-earned premarital assets to back a failing, unsecured tech startup. She would never willingly risk her children's entire financial future on Julian's pathetic delusions of grandeur. I digitally zoomed in on her signature until the dark ink was massive on my screen. I quickly pulled up a digital copy of a legal brief she had sent me a year ago and compared the two signatures side by side. The naked, untrained eye might not catch the incredibly subtle differences, but I had spent my entire professional life closely analyzing fraudulent documents. The pen pressure points were completely wrong. The natural flowing loop of the letters was hesitant and unnaturally stiff. It was a very highly skilled forgery, but it was undeniably and absolutely a forgery. My brother had not just stolen my $4.5 million inheritance trust fund. He had actively, maliciously, and criminally forged his own wife's signature to secretly mortgage her entire life's work without her knowledge. The sheer massive scale of his sociopathic behavior was absolutely staggering to fully comprehend. He was actively destroying the two most prominent, successful women in his life, just to artificially inflate his own massive, fragile ego. He had effortlessly stolen from his own blood sister, and he was currently actively framing his own loyal wife. If his tech startup officially collapsed, which was a mathematical absolute certainty, at this current aggressive burn rate, the commercial bank would instantly aggressively call in the massive loan. When Julian inevitably defaulted, the aggressive banking lawyers would immediately move to legally seize Maya's 3 commercial properties. She would completely lose absolutely everything she had spent her entire adult life painstakingly building. And because her forged signature was permanently affixed to the official federal loan documents as the primary guarantor, the federal government would hold her completely and entirely legally responsible for the massive, staggering debt. The catastrophic professional consequences for her would be absolute and immediate. As a practicing corporate attorney, she would be instantly reported to the state ethics board. She would be permanently disbarred and lose her hard-earned license to practice law forever. She could even face severe federal prison time for wire fraud and major bank fraud. Julian was actively knowingly setting up his highly successful, brilliant African-American wife to take the ultimate catastrophic federal fall for his own pathetic criminal incompetence. The cold, calculating rage inside me suddenly shifted from a bitter, personal family vendetta to a profound, overwhelming sense of protective, righteous fury. I sat back in the booth and carefully closed the digital file, securely saving it to my completely encrypted external hard drive. I systematically backed up every single corporate tax return, the disastrous balance sheets, and the forged commercial loan documents. I meticulously compiled every single piece of damning financial evidence into one massive, comprehensive digital dossier. The sun was fully rising now, casting a pale, cold, harsh light across the empty, icy parking lot of the diner. My hands were no longer shaking even slightly. My mind was completely clear, sharp, and intensely focused on the primary objective. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I could not possibly fight this massive federal-level war completely alone. I needed a highly skilled ally with extreme corporate legal firepower. I needed someone who was about to absolutely hate Julian just as much as I currently did. I completely closed my laptop and slid slowly out of the cracked red vinyl booth. I left a crisp $20 bill on the sticky table for the tired waitress. I walked out into the freezing, brutal Chicago morning air, feeling a completely new sense of absolute deadly purpose. I was going to find Maya, and I was going to explicitly show her exactly what kind of monster she was legally married to. I drove straight to the financial district of downtown Chicago and navigated my car into the subterranean parking garage of the elite corporate law firm where my sister-in-law Maya worked as a senior litigation partner. The garage was a massive underground cavern of cold gray concrete, harsh fluorescent lights, and the echoing sounds of expensive luxury vehicles. I parked my modest sedan in a dark corner 2 levels down, completely out of sight of the security cameras. I knew Maya's schedule perfectly because Julian used to complain endlessly about her long billing hours. She always arrived at the office by 7 in the morning sharp, I stepped out of my car into the freezing damp air of the garage. My clothes were still slightly damp from the winter storm last night, and I had not slept a single second. But the pure adrenaline pumping through my veins made me feel completely invincible. I walked over to the reserved executive parking section and found her designated spot. I stood in the deep shadows behind a massive concrete pillar, clutching a thick manila envelope tightly against my chest. Inside that envelope was the absolute destruction of her entire life. I waited in the freezing shadows for 45 minutes. Finally, the sharp echoing click of high heels on concrete broke the silence of the massive underground structure. I peeked around the rough edge of the pillar. Maya was walking briskly toward her reserved parking space. She looked absolutely formidable. She was a stunning, fiercely intelligent African-American woman dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal gray designer suit. She carried a heavy leather briefcase in one hand and her car keys in the other. Her posture was perfectly straight, projecting an aura of absolute authority and unyielding confidence. This was a woman who spent her days utterly destroying massive corporations in federal courtrooms. She was brilliant, ruthless, and fiercely protective of the life she had built from scratch. As she approached her gleaming silver Lexus SUV, I stepped out from behind the concrete pillar and walked directly into her line of sight, blocking her path to the driver's side door. Maya stopped dead in her tracks. Her dark eyes narrowed instantly, and her entire body tensed with immediate defensive aggression. She did not look surprised to see me. She looked profoundly annoyed. She let out a sharp, heavy sigh and shifted her leather briefcase to her other hand. She looked at my wrinkled clothes and my pale, exhausted face. Her voice echoed loudly in the empty concrete garage, dripping with professional condescension and thinly veiled pity. She told me that I had absolutely no right to be ambushing her in her private workplace parking garage. She said my mother, Cynthia, had already called her early this morning to warn her about my erratic behavior. Maya stated firmly that she knew all about the massive argument last night. She said she knew that I was incredibly bitter and completely unstable because the family had rightfully decided to invest my father's trust fund into Julian's business instead of letting me hoard the cash. I stood there in silence, letting her speak. It was genuinely sickening to hear how quickly and efficiently Cynthia and my brother had spun their vicious lies to poison Maya against me. They had preemptively painted me as a greedy, jealous sister who was having a complete mental breakdown. Maya took a step closer, her tone becoming even more rigid and lawyerly. She told me that I needed to seek immediate professional psychiatric help. She said my obsessive jealousy over Julian's massive success was destroying my mind and tearing our family apart. She explicitly warned me that if I ever tried to contact Julian or harass my mother again, she would personally draft a binding restraining order against me before the end of the business day. She pulled out her keys and pressed the unlock button. The Lexus chirped loudly in the quiet garage. She told me to move out of her way right now and go back to my cheap apartment before she called the building security to have me forcibly escorted off the premises. I did not move a single inch. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against her cruel accusations. I knew arguing with a senior corporate litigator was a complete waste of time. They are professionally trained to weaponize your emotions against you in an argument. Instead, I looked her dead in the eyes with absolute cold clarity. The profound silence between us stretched for several agonizing seconds. Maya's confident expression began to falter just slightly as she registered the total absence of panic or anger in my face. I raised my hands and held up the thick manila envelope. I told her that she was an incredibly brilliant lawyer, but a remarkably blind wife. I said she had spent the last 3 years building a massive legal fortress around a man who was actively selling the foundation right out from under her feet. Maya let out a short, dismissive laugh and reached for the door handle of her SUV. She told me she did not have time for my paranoid delusions. Before she could open the heavy car door, I stepped forward and slammed the thick manila envelope directly onto the pristine hood of her silver Lexus. The heavy sound echoed sharply through the empty parking garage. I pressed my hand flat against the brown paper and stared intensely into her eyes. My voice was low, steady, and absolutely deadly. I told her that I was a senior tax auditor and I did not deal in paranoid delusions. I dealt entirely in federal tax returns, state corporate filings, and official banking records. I removed my hand from the envelope and took one deliberate step back. I told her she was about to lose her law license, her townhouse, and her kids' college funds. Counselor. Maya froze completely. The authoritative corporate lawyer facade instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp flash of genuine confusion and deep primal alarm. The specific mention of her children and her hard-earned law license pierced directly through her defensive armor. I pointed to the manila folder sitting on the hood of her car. I told her that Julian's tech startup was not a massive success. It was a failing, catastrophic shell game, currently $4.2 million in debt. I told her that he had officially completely run out of cash 6 weeks ago and had to secure a massive $2 million commercial loan just to keep the lights on and maintain his fake rich lifestyle. Maya stared at the envelope, but she did not touch it. Her highly trained legal mind was rapidly processing the terrifying implications of my words, but her heart was still desperately trying to deny them. She shook her head slightly and told me that Julian would never do that. She said he knew she kept her finances completely separate and that her commercial properties were legally protected premarital assets. I nodded slowly, confirming her exact legal structure. Then I delivered the final crushing blow. I told her that Julian knew exactly how valuable those 3 historic properties were. I told her that a massive national commercial bank does not hand $2 million in liquid cash to a failing company without ironclad tangible collateral. I watched the blood slowly drain from her beautiful face as the horrifying realization finally hit her. I told her to open the envelope. I instructed her to look specifically at the 3rd page of the Federal Uniform Commercial Code filing. I told her she would find a heavily notarized commercial banking agreement, legally pledging all 3 of her commercial real estate properties as the primary collateral for Julian's massive business loan. Maya dropped her heavy leather briefcase onto the concrete floor. She reached out with trembling hands and pulled the thick stack of papers from the manila envelope. She flipped rapidly through the dense financial documents. Her eyes darted frantically across the columns of debt, the disastrous balance sheets, and the official state tax records. She finally reached the back of the packet. She found the official federal loan agreement. She stared at the final signature page for a very long time. The silence in the underground garage was absolutely suffocating. I watched her perfectly manicured finger slowly trace the dark blue ink of the signature printed at the bottom of the page. It was the exact same perfect forgery technique he had used to steal my inheritance. Julian had flawlessly copied her elegant flowing handwriting to sign her life away to a national bank. Maya's breathing became shallow and rapid. Her sharp legal mind instantly recognized the absolute severity of the situation. As the primary unconditional guarantor of a fraudulent $2 million federal bank loan, she was legally completely exposed. The bank could seize her properties tomorrow. The state ethics board would permanently strip her of her law license for participating in massive financial fraud. She would face federal criminal charges. Julian had effectively handed her a professional and financial death sentence. Maya slowly looked up from the papers. The hostility and the condescension were entirely gone. Her dark eyes were wide and filled with a terrifying mixture of absolute shock, profound heartbreak, and a rapidly building homicidal rage. This was the exact moment she stopped being Cynthia's manipulated puppet and realized she was just another victim of Julian's sociopathic greed. She looked at me with a completely new understanding. She realized that my mother and my brother had not just stolen my money. They had engineered a massive criminal conspiracy, and they were planning to let Maya take the ultimate fall when the entire house of cards inevitably collapsed. I did not offer her any fake sympathy. I did not try to comfort her. I spoke to her exactly like a peer facing a massive hostile corporate takeover. I told her that Julian's lenders were demanding a comprehensive financial audit by the end of next week. I explained that when the bank auditors discovered the massive discrepancies in his stated revenue, they would immediately freeze all of his accounts and aggressively move to seize her properties to recoup their $2 million. I told her she had exactly 5 business days before the bank destroyed her entire life and sent her to federal prison. I stood perfectly still in the freezing damp air of the underground garage, watching the brilliant corporate lawyer process the total destruction of her reality. Maya leaned heavily against the cold silver metal of her vehicle. The papers shook violently in her hands. She started whispering the legal codes to herself. wire fraud, bank fraud, uttering a forged instrument, federal conspiracy. She was mentally listing the exact criminal charges she and Julian were currently facing. She looked at me, her voice barely above a harsh whisper. She asked me how he could possibly think he would get away with this. She asked how he planned to hide a $2 million commercial loan from his own wife, who happened to be a senior corporate litigator. I answered her with the cold, brutal truth. I told her that Julian never respected her intelligence. He only saw her as a highly valuable financial asset to be exploited. He assumed she was too busy working 80 hours a week at her law firm to ever double-check her personal credit monitoring alerts. He was banking entirely on her blind absolute trust in him as her husband. I stepped closer to her, invading her personal space. I told her that my mother and my brother were throwing a massive, expensive gala this coming Saturday night at the downtown hotel. They were planning to celebrate their stolen wealth and solidify their fake social status. I told her that Cynthia had the sheer audacity to invite me to this gala to offer me $20,000 in hush money. I watched Maya's jaw clench so tightly I thought her teeth might crack. The absolute betrayal by the man she loved had instantly mutated into a cold, calculating desire for complete, absolute vengeance. She was no longer a heartbroken wife. She was a lethal apex predator who had just been backed into a corner. Maya carefully, neatly stacked the fraudulent loan documents and slid them safely back into the manila envelope. She gripped the folder tightly, holding onto it like a literal lifeline. She looked past me into the dark concrete shadows of the garage, her mind already drafting the legal war she was about to unleash. She turned her fierce, dark eyes back to mine and asked me exactly what we were going to do next. Maya did not say a single word for several long, agonizing minutes. She stood completely frozen in the dim, flickering fluorescent light of the massive underground parking garage, staring intensely at the dense stack of financial documents resting on the cold silver hood of her luxury vehicle. The initial shock that had drained the warm color from her beautiful face was rapidly being replaced by the sharp, cold, brutal calculation of a seasoned corporate litigator. I watched her highly trained eyes rapidly scan the dense, complex paragraphs of the Federal Uniform Commercial Code filings. She was no longer reading them as a betrayed, heartbroken wife. She was analytically processing them as a high-powered defense attorney evaluating a catastrophic federal criminal indictment. Her perfectly manicured index finger slowly traced the exact black-printed lines of the primary guarantor schedule. She stopped specifically at the third page, the ultimate signature page. I saw her tight jaw muscles feather slightly as she deeply scrutinized the dark blue ink that falsely legally bound her 3 historic commercial properties to my brother's massive failing tech startup. She leaned in much closer, her breathing shallow but incredibly controlled. She began to rapidly mutter the specific federal criminal statutes under her breath. Federal Code Title, 18 Section 1344. Bank fraud. Aggravated identity theft. Wire fraud. She knew the exact mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for each individual federal count, up to 30 years in a federal penitentiary and a financial penalty of over $1 million per count. Julian had not simply forged a basic document to secure a desperate business loan. He had deliberately and maliciously weaponized her own pristine legal identity against her. He had systematically hijacked her flawless credit score, her hard-earned commercial real estate assets, and her entire professional legal reputation just to artificially prop up his pathetic, fragile ego and maintain his fake, wealthy lifestyle. Maya finally lifted her heavy head from the cold hood of the car. The condescending hostility she had shown me just 15 minutes ago was completely, entirely gone. In its exact place was a terrifying, absolute, icy calm. It was the exact same absolute dark clarity I had felt sitting alone in my freezing sedan a few hours earlier. The horrific realization hit her with absolute crushing finality. Julian had profoundly, brutally betrayed both of us without a single second of hesitation. She looked directly at me, and the unspoken, profound understanding between us was instantaneous and absolute. We were 2 incredibly capable, highly successful, independent women who had been systematically manipulated and financially exploited by the exact same toxic family dynamic. My mother, Cynthia, and my brother, Julian, had aggressively manipulated my deep sense of familial duty to completely drain my personal financial resources and seamlessly steal my $4.5 million inheritance. Simultaneously, Julian had shamelessly exploited Maya's unwavering loyal trust as his supportive wife to secretly, illegally mortgage her entire financial future. They had played us both for absolute fools. They honestly thought my quiet, passive obedience and Maya's intense, demanding 80-hour workweeks made us the perfect, easy targets. They severely and fatally underestimated exactly who they were dealing with in the dark. Maya slowly stood up straight, her posture rigid and naturally commanding. She told me in a low, harsh whisper that Cynthia had actually called her twice yesterday afternoon, specifically planting the toxic seeds of doubt to completely isolate me from anyone who could help. My mother had carefully fabricated a vicious narrative that I was currently suffering a severe psychotic mental breakdown, so that when I inevitably discovered the forgery and tried to warn Maya about the massive financial discrepancies, she would immediately dismiss me as a bitter, jealous lunatic. It was a highly orchestrated, ruthless psychological isolation tactic designed entirely to protect their stolen millions. Maya confessed with a heavy voice that she had actually believed their lies because she could not possibly fathom a dark reality where her own husband, the father of her 2 young children, was actively meticulously plotting her total financial ruin behind her back. I nodded slowly, deeply, acknowledging the painful, devastating truth of her words. I told her that financial sociopaths simply do not operate with the same moral constraints or emotional empathy as normal human beings. They view our basic human decency, our empathy, and our blind trust as massive, glaring weaknesses to be aggressively exploited for personal gain. But I assured her that their absolute greatest fatal mistake was pushing the 2 of us into the exact same dark corner. Maya picked up the heavy manila envelope containing the forged documents and clutched it incredibly tightly against her chest like a physical shield. She looked directly, deeply into my eyes and formally proposed an unbreakable alliance. It was not a soft pact born of sudden sisterly affection or forced familial warmth. It was a ruthless, highly calculated military-grade legal alliance forged in the dark, freezing, damp shadows of a concrete parking garage. We combined our massive, unique, specialized professional skill sets instantly without missing a beat. She brought the overwhelming, terrifying legal authority of a senior corporate law partner. She knew exactly how to aggressively navigate the incredibly complex labyrinth of the federal court system, how to swiftly draft ironclad emergency asset freezes, and how to legally, violently compel massive banking institutions to immediately comply with our strict demands. I brought the aggressive, meticulous forensic tax accounting expertise. I knew exactly how to systematically track every single stolen dollar through Julian's convoluted, messy shell companies, how to completely break down his fraudulent corporate tax returns, and how to absolutely legally, mathematically prove his massive federal tax evasion to the government. Together, we formed a completely unstoppable force. We firmly established our absolute strict rules of engagement right then and there. There would be absolutely zero mercy. There would be absolutely no hesitation or second guessing. We would categorically not accept any pathetic apologies, and we would absolutely not negotiate any quiet, private family financial settlements. We were going to completely systematically dismantle my brother and my mother piece by piece until they had absolutely nothing left to their names. Maya stated firmly with cold venom in her voice that she was going to personally, legally ensure Julian spent the next full decade rotting in a federal penitentiary, and she was going to quickly take full, permanent, physical, and legal custody of their children, stripping him of all parental rights. I agreed completely and wholeheartedly. I told her I was going to legally, ruthlessly seize every single financial asset Cynthia currently possessed to recover my stolen trust fund, even if it meant throwing my own mother out onto the freezing city streets with nothing but the clothes on her back. But our lethal, highly effective, newly formed alliance faced one massive, immediate, catastrophic problem that threatened to destroy everything before we even started. I stepped much closer to Maya, invading her personal space, my voice dropping to an urgent, intense whisper. I told her we absolutely did not have the luxury of time to slowly, methodically build a perfect legal case over the next few months. I explicitly explained the massive ticking financial time bomb I had discovered buried deep in the encrypted banking communication logs I had audited early this morning. The massive national commercial bank that had recklessly issued the $2 million corporate loan was completely panicking. Julian had already completely missed his first two massive mandatory quarterly interest payments. The aggressive, nervous banking executives were currently demanding a comprehensive mandatory on-site financial audit of his entire tech startup by the very end of next week. I laid out the absolute terrifying, brutal reality of our immediate situation when those highly trained, ruthless bank auditors physically arrived at his leased luxury penthouse office. Next week, they would immediately demand to see the physical, raw banking data. They would instantly mathematically realize his stated gross revenue was entirely fabricated out of thin air, and his corporate entity was officially completely bankrupt. The very exact second the massive bank officially declared a formal financial default, their highly aggressive corporate lawyers would immediately execute the guarantor clause attached to the loan. They would legally, brutally seize Maya's 3 historic commercial properties before the end of the current month, effectively wiping out her entire net worth. Even worse, when the massive, staggering fraud was officially formally uncovered by the banking institution, the federal investigators would immediately, logically assume Maya was a willing, active co-conspirator in the crime. Because her legal name and her flawlessly forged signature were physically firmly printed on the primary loan documents, the FBI would inevitably arrive at her prestigious corporate law firm and arrest her in handcuffs directly in front of her shocked colleagues. She would lose her hard-earned law license immediately pending a massive, highly publicized federal criminal trial. Maya's dark, intelligent eyes widened slightly as the sheer, immediate, visceral panic fully set in. Her brilliant legal mind rapidly calculated the incredibly shrinking, terrifying timeline. She told me fiercely that if the bank discovered the massive fraud first, she would be completely, entirely, professionally ruined. We absolutely had to strike first and strike flawlessly. We had to completely aggressively expose Julian to the federal authorities before the commercial bank initiated their own independent audit. We had to legally, definitively prove she was a targeted victim of severe identity theft before the bank lawyers officially froze her personal assets. But to do that effectively and legally, we needed the absolute, undeniable physical proof. We needed the original physical documents. Digital scanned copies and downloaded state tax forms were absolutely excellent for building a preliminary investigation, but to immediately legally secure a massive federal indictment and an emergency federal asset freeze, we desperately needed the original wet ink signatures. I told Maya that I knew exactly where Julian and Cynthia were secretly hiding the original forged inheritance waiver and the original copies of the fraudulent bank loans. Cynthia possessed a highly secure, large family safe deposit box at a private, exclusive bank downtown. She had arrogantly bragged about its absolute security for years. Maya's eyes narrowed sharply, a sudden brilliant spark of realization hitting her. She told me that Julian had actually stupidly added her name to that specific private bank account 2 years ago to falsely legally inflate his own credit profile for a different loan. Because of his own arrogant oversight, she was officially legally authorized to access that specific secure safe deposit box without his permission. The freezing, damp air of the underground garage suddenly felt incredibly electric. The final, absolutely crucial piece of our immediate offensive strategy snapped perfectly seamlessly into place. Maya looked quickly at her expensive silver wristwatch and then back at me, her expression completely hardened into pure, unyielding steel. Her voice was pure authority. She told me we had exactly 5 days to completely, utterly destroy my brother before he legally destroyed her. She aggressively threw her heavy leather briefcase into the passenger seat of her luxury Lexus. The long, desperate hunt was no longer in the quiet planning phase. We were officially moving directly into active, brutal execution. I sat in the passenger seat of Maya's silver Lexus, perfectly still, as we parked exactly 3 blocks away from the massive First National Fidelity Bank in downtown Chicago. It was early Wednesday morning, and the heavy gray sky hung extremely low over the freezing city. The brutal winter wind violently rattled the street signs, but inside the luxurious insulated cabin of the vehicle, the silence between us was incredibly thick and heavy with absolute deadly purpose. We had spent the last 48 hours operating on zero sleep, meticulously, aggressively preparing for this exact, highly dangerous moment. I had utilized my advanced professional auditing software and high-grade legal paper to painstakingly manufacture a completely visually identical decoy of the forged inheritance waiver. It possessed the exact same heavy premium paper weight, the exact same standard state legal formatting, and an incredibly highly convincing color printed replica of the state notary seal. Unless a trained forensic analyst was actively specifically looking for a high-level forgery, it would easily, completely pass a casual visual inspection by my arrogant mother or my careless brother. Maya was sitting behind the leather steering wheel, wearing a stunning, impeccably tailored navy blue designer suit. She looked like a woman who owned the entire financial district. She projected an aura of absolute unyielding corporate power. We reviewed the operational plan one final, highly detailed time. 2 years ago, Julian had foolishly, arrogantly added Maya's legal name to his primary financial accounts to falsely artificially inflate his own personal credit score. Because my mother, Cynthia, had explicitly linked her private, highly secure safe deposit box to Julian's primary checking account to easily, seamlessly transfer large sums of stolen wealth, Maya was legally, technically, officially listed as an authorized secondary signer on the bank's internal registry. It was a massive, catastrophic, arrogant oversight on their part. But traditional banking institutions are incredibly cautious and highly paranoid entities. If the senior branch manager decided to casually call Julian to simply politely verify this unexpected sudden access by his wife, our entire carefully constructed plan would violently, instantly implode, leaving us exposed to massive federal trespassing charges. Maya looked directly into my eyes, her expression completely hardened into pure, absolute steel. She confidently promised me that she would personally handle the senior branch manager. She explicitly stated that aggressive corporate psychological intimidation was her absolute professional specialty. We stepped out of the warm vehicle and walked briskly through the freezing, chaotic morning commuter traffic toward the massive, heavy brass front doors of the exclusive banking institution. We entered the building at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. The interior of the bank was excessively, incredibly opulent. It featured massive, high-polished marble ceilings, dark, rich mahogany teller counters, and an atmosphere of absolute, heavy, suffocating quiet. I walked silently over to a plush, dark leather waiting chair positioned strategically near the main entrance, pretending to casually deeply read a thick, glossy financial magazine. My heart was pounding so incredibly hard against my ribs. I could literally hear the heavy, rapid rushing of blood roaring loudly in my ears. Maya did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She walked with long, powerful, commanding strides directly toward the senior branch manager's private enclosed glass office located in the back corner of the pristine marble floor. She absolutely did not knock or politely ask the hovering assistant for permission to enter. She simply aggressively opened the heavy glass door, walked right in, and sat down firmly in the expensive leather guest chair. I watched the manager, a middle-aged man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit, visibly, physically jump in his seat at her sudden, overwhelming, aggressive presence. Maya placed her heavy, expensive leather briefcase deliberately onto the center of his organized desk with a loud, sharp thud. She introduced herself clearly as Maya Julian's wife and a senior litigation partner at her highly prestigious corporate law firm. She intentionally spoke in a loud, incredibly crisp, clear voice that carried perfectly easily across the quiet, open bank floor. She firmly told the nervous manager that she was currently conducting a highly sensitive, massive emergency audit of her family's physical financial assets for an upcoming, highly lucrative commercial real estate acquisition. She reached into her tailored jacket and aggressively handed him her heavy metal corporate identification card, her state driver license, and her official State Bar Association legal credentials. She aggressively demanded immediate unrestricted physical access to secure safe deposit box number 412. The manager stammered heavily, his face flushing a bright, nervous pink, as he frantically typed her credentials into his secure computer terminal. He looked incredibly, intensely nervous. He politely, weakly mentioned that normally Mr. Julian or Mrs. Cynthia were the only specific individuals who physically accessed this particular highly secure box. Maya absolutely did not blink. She leaned her upper body slowly forward over his desk and deliberately lowered her voice to a dangerous, low, authoritative corporate timbre. She explicitly told him that as a legally verified authorized signer currently standing inside his bank, she absolutely did not require their physical presence or their specific permission. She aggressively, explicitly reminded him of the strict federal banking regulations regarding authorized secondary access, and she heavily, darkly implied that any further unnecessary administrative delay would immediately, inevitably result in a massive, highly destructive, formal legal complaint filed directly to the Federal Banking Commission by her powerful law firm. The manager completely physically withered under her intense, highly trained legal glare. He rapidly, completely surrendered. He quickly, aggressively grabbed the heavy brass master key from his secure drawer and nervously escorted her toward the massive, imposing steel vault door located at the very back of the facility. Maya completely disappeared behind the thick, heavy steel bars of the primary vault. The heavy metal gate clicked shut with a loud, terrifying finality, locking her safely inside the secure private customer viewing room. My highly anxious eyes were completely glued to the large traditional face clock hanging prominently above the main teller station. Every single passing second felt like an entire agonizing, incredibly stressful hour. Inside the secure vault, Maya later meticulously detailed to me exactly what happened in the dark. The walls of the cold, secure room were perfectly lined with thousands of small, identical brushed steel doors. She carefully inserted her personal access key precisely alongside the nervous manager's master key directly into box number 412. The heavy metal drawer slid outward with a smooth, highly satisfying metallic scrape. The manager then formally completely left her alone inside the small private viewing room, quietly closing the heavy door behind him to strictly maintain required client financial confidentiality. Maya pulled the deep, cold metal box entirely out and placed it heavily onto the central wooden viewing table. Inside, sitting directly on top of a disorganized stack of expensive velvet jewelry bags and bundled cash, was a thick, premium, cream-colored legal folder. She opened the heavy folder with slightly trembling hands. There it was, the absolute original physical copy of my forged inheritance waiver. The dark, bold blue ink of my entirely fake signature seemed to violently, actively burn a massive hole directly through the heavy paper. Sitting directly underneath it, securely paper-clipped together, were the absolute original physical copies of the highly fraudulent commercial banking loans, legally pledging her 3 historic commercial properties to the massive national bank. The sheer heavy physical reality of the horrific, devastating financial crimes committed against both of us was sitting right there, physically resting in her own hands. She absolutely did not hesitate. The clock was aggressively ticking. She quickly pulled out her secure, highly encrypted personal cell phone and rapidly, methodically took highly detailed, high-resolution digital photographs of every single page. She meticulously, perfectly captured the exact specific texture of the premium paper, the highly specific microscopic indentations of the pen strokes, and the raised, highly visible, embossed ridges of the state-certified notary seal. Once the massive digital copies were safely, securely, successfully uploaded directly to our highly encrypted remote cloud server, she very carefully extracted my original forged inheritance document and swiftly, flawlessly replaced it with the completely identical decoy document I had meticulously crafted. She smoothly slid the highly dangerous real document deeply into a hidden, zippered, secure compartment inside her heavy leather briefcase. She was just absolutely about to close the heavy steel lid of the safe deposit box when her encrypted cell phone suddenly vibrated violently, aggressively against the hard wooden viewing table. The sudden harsh sound in the dead quiet vault was completely terrifying. She quickly, aggressively glanced down at the glowing digital screen. It was absolutely not a text message from me. It was a highly secure, automated digital SMS security alert generated directly from the bank's internal private network. Julian had specifically, secretly set up a silent, automated text message alert system to immediately, instantly notify his personal cell phone whenever his primary linked financial accounts were physically, digitally, or manually accessed by anyone. A massive, overwhelming cold wave of pure, absolute terror violently washed completely over her entire body. Julian explicitly knew, Right at this very exact terrifying second, my highly arrogant brother was actively staring directly at a digital text message, explicitly telling him that someone was currently physically standing inside his mother's highly secret private safe deposit box. Maya deeply, violently, fully realized she had to move immediately. She aggressively, violently shoved the heavy metal drawer back into the solid steel wall and violently, aggressively twisted her key, locking it completely tight. Suddenly, without any warning, the heavy, secure outer door handle of the private viewing room began to rapidly, loudly rattle. Through the thick, heavy, frosted privacy glass, she could easily hear the muffled, frantic, urgent ringing of the senior branch manager's desk phone, loudly echoing aggressively out on the main marble bank floor. Julian was absolutely actively calling the bank directly to aggressively demand exactly who was currently physically standing inside the secure vault. Maya's highly trained, incredibly sharp legal mind rapidly, flawlessly calculated the exact terrifying immediate timeline. The manager would answer the ringing phone. Julian would aggressively, violently scream at him to immediately lock down the entire vault and instantly call the local police. The terrified manager would then immediately press the silent alarm and physically signal the two large armed security guards currently standing by the heavy brass front doors. She calculated that she had precisely 90 seconds to get completely out of that massive heavy steel cage before the manager officially fully realized he had been completely expertly played and officially ordered the heavy security doors to electronically permanently seal her inside for the police. Maya aggressively grabbed her heavy leather briefcase and practically violently kicked the viewing room door completely open. She stepped forcefully out into the main central vault corridor just as the highly nervous branch manager was physically picking up his aggressively ringing desk phone out on the main open marble floor. Through the heavy, thick steel bars of the primary vault gate, she made direct, intense, terrifying eye contact with me, sitting innocently in the front lobby. Her dark, highly expressive eyes were completely wide with absolute fierce, terrifying urgency. I instantly stood up from the plush leather chair and deliberately dropped the glossy financial magazine directly onto the polished floor. Maya walked rapidly toward the secure vault exit with long, incredibly rapid, highly powerful, aggressive strides. She absolutely deliberately did not run. Running would instantly trigger the highly trained armed security guards to aggressively draw their weapons and tackle her. She walked with the absolute terrifying extreme purpose of a highly aggressive, angry corporate executive who was simply incredibly late for a very important massive meeting. She aggressively pushed her way through the heavy steel vault gate just as the terrified manager formally answered his desk phone. I could clearly hear the manager say Julian's name in a highly confused, incredibly nervous, loud tone. Maya absolutely did not even briefly look at him. She walked directly aggressively past his enclosed glass office, her expensive high heels clicking like rapid, heavy gunfire against the highly polished marble floor. I fell instantly, perfectly into step right beside her, mirroring her exact, highly aggressive pace. We marched directly, forcefully toward the heavy, massive brass front doors. I could instantly clearly hear the branch manager suddenly loudly shout from his glass office. His voice was completely heavily laced with sudden, rapidly rising, sheer absolute panic. He yelled frantically for the armed security guards to wait. He yelled aggressively for Maya to immediately stop walking. The two incredibly large, heavily armed security guards, standing casually near the main entrance, instinctively immediately reached for their heavy-duty communication radios and physically began to step directly forcefully into our exact exit path. Maya absolutely did not slow her pace a single microscopic inch. She looked directly aggressively into the eyes of the largest, nearest security guard and loudly barked a sharp, highly authoritative, absolutely terrifying corporate legal command. She explicitly, aggressively told him to step aside immediately, instantly, or she would personally, absolutely, completely sue him and the entire banking institution for unlawful, illegal, violent detainment. The sheer, absolute, overwhelming raw confidence and pure legal aggression in her loud, clear voice caused the massive trained guard to slightly hesitate for one single, absolutely fatal second. He physically, defensively stepped back just half an inch. It was absolutely all the physical space we desperately needed. We violently, aggressively pushed our combined body weight through the heavy brass exterior doors and practically spilled out directly onto the freezing, incredibly crowded, busy Chicago sidewalk. We absolutely did not look back over our shoulders. We aggressively power walked deeply down the busy city street, blending instantly, seamlessly into the massive, chaotic, moving sea of heavy morning commuters. We rapidly, quickly reached her silver luxury Lexus parked exactly 3 blocks away. We violently threw ourselves directly into the cold vehicle, and Maya violently, aggressively slammed her heavy shoe directly onto the gas pedal. The highly powerful car engine aggressively roared as we violently merged directly into the heavy, aggressive city traffic, leaving the massive bank and the panicked security guards far completely behind us. Maya gripped the cold leather steering wheel so incredibly tightly that her knuckles were completely pure white. She let out a massive, heavy, violently shaking breath and finally slowly looked directly over at me. She reached over with a slightly trembling hand and unzipped the highly secure hidden compartment of her expensive leather briefcase. She slowly, carefully pulled out the absolute original physical forged inheritance waiver and dropped it directly forcefully onto my lap. The heavy premium paper felt incredibly, incredibly powerful in my cold hands. We finally, officially possessed the absolute, undeniable physical legal proof. The massive, highly destructive federal trap was now fully, completely, officially set. We did not go back to my cheap apartment or Maya's prestigious law firm. We drove directly to a highly secure private office park located deep in the northern suburbs of Chicago. As a senior tax auditor handling massive corporate accounts, I had spent years building a very specific network of elite professional contacts. When you audit millionaires, you inevitably encounter highly sophisticated financial fraud. I needed an absolute master to physically authenticate our stolen evidence. I directed Maya to pull her silver Lexus into the private parking lot of a boutique forensic accounting firm run by a man named David. David was a former federal handwriting analyst who had spent 20 years testifying as an expert witness for the Federal Bureau of Investigation before opening his own incredibly lucrative private practice. He was meticulously precise, incredibly expensive, and completely legally bulletproof in a federal courtroom. We walked into his sterile, brightly lit laboratory environment. Maya carefully unzipped her heavy leather briefcase and used a pair of sterile forensic tweezers to extract the forged inheritance waiver. She placed the heavy premium paper gently onto the massive glass examination table. David did not ask us any unnecessary personal questions. He simply leaned over the document, adjusting the powerful magnification lenses attached to his heavy black glasses. He flipped on a series of intense ultraviolet and infrared examination lights. Maya and I stood perfectly still in the sterile quiet room, watching him meticulously study the deep blue ink. He examined the microscopic paper fibers, the specific pressure indentations of the pen strokes, and the chemical composition of the state notary seal. After 20 agonizing minutes of absolute silence, he finally turned off the intense examination lights and looked directly at us. He explicitly confirmed what I already absolutely knew. The signature was a highly skilled but ultimately completely structural forgery. The specific hesitation marks and the unnatural ink pooling at the bottom of the letters proved it was a slow calculated tracing, not a natural fluid biological signature. He legally took physical custody of the document to process it through his advanced chemical analysis equipment. He promised to deliver a fully notarized sworn federal affidavit, legally declaring the document a massive criminal forgery within exactly 48 hours. We had officially successfully secured the absolute physical proof of their crime. But proving the forgery was only the very first step of our massive counterattack. We immediately left David's laboratory and checked into a completely anonymous business suite at a massive corporate hotel near the airport, paying entirely in cash to leave absolutely no digital footprint. We instantly transformed the generic hotel room into a highly aggressive, secure digital war room. Maya sat at the glass dining table, aggressively typing on her encrypted laptop, furiously drafting the massive complex federal civil injunctions and emergency asset freezes she would need to violently protect her 3 historic commercial properties. I sat on the edge of the large bed connecting my heavy professional auditing laptop to an encrypted virtual private network. It was finally time for me to do exactly what I did best. I was going to officially, legally weaponize the federal government against my own family. I opened a massive blank digital dossier and began systematically building a highly classified whistleblower packet directly for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The federal investigators are not simply a group of polite accountants who politely ask you to pay your back taxes. They are elite, highly trained federal law enforcement agents who carry firearms and specifically hunt down massive criminal tax evasion, money laundering, and complex wire fraud. They boast a terrifyingly high federal conviction rate. When they decide to target a financial criminal, they completely, absolutely destroy them. I started by meticulously mapping the exact flow of my stolen $4.5 million trust fund. I traced the specific wire transfers from the Secure Family Trust directly into Julian's primary personal checking account. I then tracked how he aggressively, illegally funneled that stolen, untaxed wealth directly into his failing tech startup, using a highly complex, confusing web of fake corporate shell companies to actively, intentionally obscure the original source of the massive capital. But Julian's massive arrogance had made him incredibly sloppy. I cross-referenced his official state corporate tax filings with the raw downloaded banking ledgers. I created highly detailed, massive digital spreadsheets explicitly proving that he was actively, intentionally claiming massive fraudulent corporate losses, while simultaneously secretly siphoning millions of dollars out of the company to fund his lavish, fake wealthy lifestyle. I documented the $100,000 imported luxury cars, the expensive designer suits, and the lavish five-star corporate dinners he illegally deducted as standard business expenses. I explicitly proved his massive intentional federal tax evasion. He was currently hiding over $3 million in taxable stolen income from the federal government. Then I aggressively added the absolute final, most highly destructive layer to the federal whistleblower packet. I securely attached the high-resolution digital photographs Maya had taken inside the massive bank vault. I included the flawless digital copies of the highly fraudulent commercial banking loans, legally pledging her 3 historic properties. I explicitly, clearly detailed exactly how Julian had maliciously forged his wife's signature to fraudulently, illegally secure $2 million in federal commercial funds across state lines. This specific, terrifying addition officially elevated his massive crimes from simple tax evasion to incredibly serious federal bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. I spent 12 straight exhausting hours staring intensely at my glowing laptop screen, systematically, mathematically, completely dismantling my brother's entire fake reality. I built a massive, legally bulletproof, airtight financial cage around him using his own exact numbers and his own exact fraud signatures. I left absolutely zero room for plausible deniability. I left absolutely zero room for a clever, expensive defense attorney to manipulate the narrative. The numbers were absolute, and the numbers proved a massive multi-million-dollar federal criminal conspiracy. By the time I finally finished formatting the massive digital packet, my eyes were incredibly burning and my shoulders were completely tight with intense exhaustion. The sun had already fully set over the freezing city of Chicago, plunging the large hotel room into deep, heavy shadows illuminated only by the bright, harsh glow of our computer screens. I compiled the massive thousands of pages of raw financial evidence, the forged documents, the explicit wire fraud maps, and the detailed tax evasion spreadsheets into one single highly encrypted, secure digital file. I navigated my web browser directly to the official, highly secure whistleblower submission portal operated by the federal government. This was not a simple email or an anonymous phone tip. This was a formal, legally binding federal submission that would instantly officially trigger a massive, highly destructive federal criminal investigation. I hovered my trembling cursor directly over the final submit button. I paused for one single heavy moment. A tiny fleeting shadow of old deep family guilt briefly tried to desperately claw its way up into my tired mind. I was about to officially, legally, permanently destroy my only brother and heavily implicate my own mother in a massive federal crime. I was about to send the federal authorities directly to their front door, but then I quickly remembered the absolute cold, terrifying disgust in Cynthia's blue eyes when she threw the medical bill at my face and viciously called me a parasite. I remembered Julian standing in my late father's study, casually sipping expensive champagne, while he successfully stole my entire future with a fake signature. They had actively, maliciously, completely destroyed our family long before I ever sat down in this dark hotel room. They had simply forced me to finally finish the brutal war they had so arrogantly started. I looked across the dark room at Maya. She was still aggressively typing on her keyboard, her beautiful face completely illuminated by her bright screen, fighting desperately to save her children's future from the man who was supposed to protect them. We had both sacrificed absolutely everything for a toxic family that viewed us entirely as disposable financial resources. I took one final deep, calming breath. I firmly pressed the trackpad and clicked the submission button. The massive encrypted digital file successfully uploaded directly to the federal government servers in a matter of seconds. A bright green confirmation screen suddenly flashed loudly across my laptop monitor, legally providing me with an official federal whistleblower tracking number. The heavy, terrifying deed was officially completely done. There was absolutely no possible way to reverse it or call it back. The incredibly massive and highly destructive machinery of the federal justice system had just been officially quietly activated. Somewhere in a highly secure federal building, specialized criminal investigators were about to receive a massive, perfectly packaged gift, wrapped federal indictment against my arrogant brother. Julian and Cynthia still honestly believed they were completely safe, sitting comfortably in their massive suburban mansion, celebrating their brilliant, flawless financial crime. They had absolutely zero idea that a massive, terrifying federal storm was currently aggressively gathering completely silently right over their heads. I slowly closed my heavy professional laptop and let out a long, heavy, shaking breath into the quiet, dark hotel room. The trap was now perfectly legally set and locked tight. We just needed the perfect, highly public moment to officially spring it and watch their entire fake empire violently, completely collapse. The pale morning sunlight barely penetrated the heavy blackout curtains of our anonymous hotel room, casting long gray shadows across the floor. The air inside the room was thick and stale, smelling faintly of burned coffee and the metallic hum of our overworked computer processors. I was sitting on the edge of the unmade bed, staring blankly at the dark screen of my laptop. The massive adrenaline rush that had fueled me through the terrifying bank heist and the grueling 12-hour process of building the federal whistleblower packet had completely evaporated, leaving behind a deep, hollow exhaustion that ached in my bones. Maya was seated at the glass dining table directly across the room. She had not slept a single second. She was still wearing the same impeccable navy blue designer suit from yesterday, but the jacket was discarded over a chair and her silk blouse was slightly wrinkled. Her dark eyes were fixed intensely on her glowing screen as her fingers flew rapidly across the keyboard, drafting the complex legal motions that would soon destroy my family. Suddenly, the heavy silence in the room was violently shattered by the sharp, aggressive ringing of my cell phone resting on the glass table. The sudden noise made both of us physically jump. I walked over and looked down at the glowing caller ID. The screen displayed a single word: Mother. My stomach instantly twisted into a tight, painful knot. Maya completely stopped typing. She slowly lifted her hands from the keyboard and looked directly at me, her expression hardening into a cold, calculating mask. She gave me a single sharp nod. I took a deep, steadying breath to completely clear the exhaustion from my mind. I pressed the green accept button and activated the speakerphone, placing the device carefully back onto the center of the glass table. Cynthia spoke first. Her voice echoed loudly in the quiet hotel room, and it was absolutely chilling in its completely fabricated warmth. There was absolutely no trace of the vicious venom she had spat at me just 3 nights ago when she threw a medical bill at my face and called me a parasite. There was no hint of the cold, ruthless woman who had calmly kicked me out into a freezing winter storm after stealing my $4.5 million inheritance. Instead, she sounded exactly like a concerned, loving mother calling to check on her mildly rebellious teenage daughter. She sighed softly into the receiver and told me that she had been thinking about our unfortunate little argument. She actually had the sheer sociopathic audacity to refer to a massive multi-million-dollar federal fraud and a brutal eviction as an unfortunate little argument. She said family fights were always so terribly emotionally draining, and she hated knowing there was tension between us. I stood perfectly still, listening to her weave her toxic manipulative web. Maya sat absolutely motionless, her dark eyes glaring intensely at the phone, as if she could physically incinerate it with her gaze. Cynthia continued her performance flawlessly. She told me that she and Julian had discussed the situation extensively. She said they both agreed that I was simply under a lot of intense professional stress at my auditing firm, and that my sudden angry outburst in the study was completely out of character. She was actively laying the psychological groundwork to completely gaslight me. She was offering me a convenient, fabricated excuse for my own righteous anger. She wanted me to believe that my outrage over a forged legal document was simply a symptom of my own mental instability. Then she slowly dropped the bait. She told me that she completely understood how difficult it was for me to manage my finances, especially after I had been so incredibly generous in helping her with the property taxes. The absolute sheer hypocrisy of her words made my blood boil completely hot, but I forced myself to remain entirely silent. She said she wanted to help me get back on my feet and find a nice new apartment. She announced with a sickeningly sweet tone of manufactured magnanimity that she had authorized a certified bank check in the amount of $20,000 specifically for me. She called it a peace offering. She said it was a gift to help me stabilize my life so we could finally put all this ugly business permanently behind us. I stared down at the phone, completely mesmerized by the sheer massive scale of her arrogance. $20,000. She was offering me a pathetic $20,000 of my own stolen money as hush money to completely cover up a $4.5 million federal crime. It was not even half of 1% of what they had actively, maliciously stolen from me. She honestly, truly believed I was so incredibly financially desperate and so deeply emotionally broken that I would blindly accept a pathetic handful of crumbs and completely walk away from the entire bakery. She thought her psychological conditioning had worked perfectly. She thought she had successfully trained me to accept whatever pathetic scraps of affection and money she casually tossed in my direction. I looked across the glass table at Maya. She was already silently typing again, her face completely devoid of any emotion. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to give Cynthia exactly what she wanted to hear. I had to play the role of the defeated, submissive, broken daughter perfectly to completely ensure she let her guard down. I forced my vocal cords to tighten deliberately, making my voice sound weak, shaky, and completely exhausted. I spoke slowly, allowing a fake, pathetic tremor to completely infiltrate my words. I told her that I was so incredibly sorry. I told her that she was absolutely right about my work stress and that I had completely overreacted to the legal paperwork. I lied with absolute flawless precision. I told her I was currently staying in a terrible cheap motel and that I was absolutely terrified about my financial future. I verbally swallowed my entire pride and explicitly thanked her for the generous $20,000 gift. I told her it would completely save my life. Cynthia let out a loud, dramatic sigh of profound relief. She was completely, utterly, entirely convinced by my performance. Her voice instantly regained its familiar, sharp, condescending edge now that she firmly believed she was completely back in control. She told me she was very glad I had finally decided to act like a rational adult. Then she smoothly, seamlessly delivered the final absolute condition of her fake truce. She told me that the family was hosting their massive annual charity gala at the exclusive downtown country club this coming Saturday night. It was an incredibly important high society event. Julian was officially inviting dozens of his wealthiest private tech investors to the party to heavily aggressively solicit another massive round of venture capital funding. Cynthia explicitly stated that it was absolutely critical for the family to present a completely united, flawless, wealthy front. She demanded that I attend the gala in person. She said she would personally hand me the $20,000 check directly in front of the entire family as a public display of our beautiful reconciliation. I instantly, clearly understood the exact dark reality of her demand. She did not want to reconcile with me. She wanted to publicly parade me around the country club like a tamed, defeated animal. She wanted to explicitly show Julian's wealthy investors that the rumors of family financial trouble were completely false by publicly demonstrating her incredible generosity toward her less fortunate, struggling daughter. She was actively using me as a completely disposable prop in her massive ongoing financial shell game. I looked directly at Maya while I answered my mother. Maya had split her glowing computer screen into two completely separate digital windows. On the left side of her screen, she was actively reviewing the highly encrypted digital whistleblower confirmation receipt I had received from the federal government earlier that morning. On the right side of her screen, she was rapidly, aggressively filling out the official federal civil court templates for a massive emergency ex parte asset freeze injunction. She was explicitly legally demanding the immediate total freezing of every single bank account, real estate property, and investment portfolio currently tied to either Cynthia or Julian. She was systematically drafting the exact legal mechanisms that would completely instantly bankrupt my mother the very second a federal judge signed the order. I spoke directly into the phone, my voice dripping with fake, overwhelming gratitude. I told Cynthia that I would absolutely be there on Saturday night. I promised her I would wear my best conservative dress and completely play the part of the happy, grateful, supportive sister. I told her I could not wait to see her and Julian and properly celebrate his massive business success. Cynthia audibly smiled through the phone line. She told me to arrive exactly at 7 o'clock and not a single minute late. She casually, abruptly ended the call without even saying goodbye. The sudden, sharp click of the disconnecting line echoed loudly in the quiet hotel room. The silence instantly flooded back in, but the entire heavy energy of the room had completely fundamentally shifted. It was no longer a room of exhaustion and desperate defense. It was a room of absolute deadly offensive preparation. I slowly reached out and turned the speakerphone completely off. I looked across the glass table at Maya. She stopped typing and looked up at me. A slow, dark, terrifyingly cold smile deliberately spread across her beautiful face. Her highly trained legal mind had already completely visualized the absolute total destruction we were about to unleash. She explicitly told me that the emergency injunctions were entirely completely finished and legally ready to be formally filed with the federal court first thing Friday morning. She explained the exact legal timeline with absolute ruthless precision. The federal judge would securely privately review the massive overwhelming evidence of the forged commercial loans and the stolen trust fund by Friday afternoon. The judge would immediately, instantly grant the emergency asset freeze completely without notifying Cynthia or Julian to strictly prevent them from rapidly hiding the stolen cash. By Saturday morning, every single financial account they possessed would be completely, entirely frozen, locked by the federal government. But because banks do not process notifications on weekends, my mother and my brother would have absolutely zero idea that they were completely, totally, entirely bankrupt until they tried to swipe their expensive credit cards. I sat there, staring at the blank screen of my phone for a long time after the call ended. The sheer magnitude of my mother's absolute toxic delusion was staggering to fully comprehend. She honestly believed that a printed check could simply erase the absolute undeniable fact that she had actively participated in a massive federal conspiracy against her own flesh and blood. She thought money was the absolute ultimate solution to every single human emotion. She thought my profound grief and my righteous fury could simply be bought and casually discarded. She was completely, fundamentally incapable of understanding the absolute terrifying power of a woman who had finally entirely stopped seeking her toxic approval. Maya reached over and gently closed the lid of her expensive encrypted laptop. The bright glow faded from her face, revealing the dark, heavy circles under her eyes. She had sacrificed her entire professional schedule, her sleep, and her own emotional stability to completely, ruthlessly dismantle the man she had loved. She looked at me with absolute, clear, unyielding resolve. We absolutely did not need to discuss the plan any further. Every single piece of the massive, complex puzzle was perfectly, seamlessly locked into its designated place. The forensic handwriting analysis was officially legally secured. The federal criminal whistleblower packet was officially submitted to the Internal Revenue Service. The emergency federal asset freeze injunctions were entirely drafted and ready for immediate secure judicial submission. We had systematically, completely surrounded them on every single possible legal and financial front. There was absolutely no possible way for them to escape the massive crushing weight of the consequences rushing toward them. Saturday night was no longer just a simple charity gala. It was going to be The absolute exact moment the universe finally, violently, forcefully demanded they pay their incredibly massive overdue bill. We simply had to wait for the sun to set on Saturday. Saturday evening finally arrived, bringing a bitter, freezing wind that violently whipped through the dark downtown streets of Chicago. I handed the keys of my cheap, modest sedan to the uniformed valet outside the towering glass facade of the five-star luxury hotel. I walked through the massive rotating brass doors and stepped directly into a staggering, overwhelming display of completely manufactured wealth. The grand ballroom was located on the highest penthouse floor, offering a massive panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. As I handed my heavy winter coat to the coat check attendant, I took a long, slow, deliberate breath to completely steady my racing heart. I was wearing a very simple, highly conservative black evening dress, exactly as my mother Cynthia had strictly instructed me to do. I kept my posture slightly rounded and my eyes deliberately lowered, completely playing the pathetic role of the broken submissive sister, arriving to beg for completely unearned financial scraps. The heavy gilded double doors of the main ballroom were pushed wide open, revealing a scene of absolute sickening extravagance. The massive ceiling was completely covered in thousands of sparkling crystal chandeliers, casting a warm, incredibly expensive golden light over the enormous room. A live professional string quartet was playing soft, elegant classical music in the far corner. Waiters, dressed in pristine white tuxedo jackets, seamlessly navigated the thick crowds carrying massive silver trays, heavily loaded with imported caviar, delicate truffle appetizers, and towering glasses of vintage French champagne. Every single magnificent element of this lavish high society party was entirely completely paid for with actively stolen money. The expensive champagne flowing freely into the crystal flutes was directly funded by my late father's $4.5 million trust fund. The massive, elaborate floral arrangements decorating every single table were violently bought with the heavily forged commercial bank loans, illegally leveraging my sister-in-law's historic real estate. I was completely surrounded by massive federal financial crimes disguised beautifully as a high society charity gala. I slowly, quietly navigated my way through the dense crowd of Chicago's wealthiest corporate elite. I immediately spotted my mother holding court near the exact center of the massive room. Cynthia was wearing an absolutely stunning floor-length emerald silk gown, heavily dripping in brilliant, expensive diamonds that my father had worked his entire life to buy for her. She was laughing loudly, her head thrown back, surrounded by a large, tight circle of wealthy, influential wives. She looked absolutely incredibly radiant, completely intoxicated by the massive fake power and the stolen social status she had violently orchestrated. She completely believed she had flawlessly executed the absolute perfect crime. She believed her highly aggressive, brutal psychological conditioning had successfully forced me into permanent silent submission. A few yards away, standing aggressively near the front of the elevated main stage, was my brother Julian. He was completely, absolutely in his element. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored black tuxedo that easily cost over $5,000. He held a crystal glass of expensive amber bourbon in one hand, while aggressively, confidently shaking hands with a group of older, wealthy men in dark suits. These were the highly elusive private venture capitalists he desperately, aggressively needed to swindle tonight. He was actively using this massive, expensive party to aggressively project an absolute illusion of total, massive corporate success, hoping to blindly convince these wealthy older men to blindly pump millions of dollars of fresh capital directly into his completely failing bankrupt tech startup. He was smiling broadly, showing his perfectly bleached white teeth, completely lying straight to their faces about his massive fabricated user metrics and his completely fake aggressive revenue growth. Standing quietly, elegantly right by his side was Maya. She looked absolutely breathtaking in a sleek, incredibly modern silver evening gown. She smiled warmly and nodded politely at the wealthy older investors, completely flawlessly playing the highly essential role of the devoted, incredibly supportive, highly successful corporate wife. But as Julian aggressively turned his back to loudly greet another incoming wealthy guest, Maya slowly looked across the crowded ballroom and directly caught my eye. The warm, polite smile instantly completely vanished from her beautiful face. Her dark, incredibly intelligent eyes were entirely completely cold and absolutely empty of any human mercy. The unspoken communication between us across the massive room was absolute and perfectly clear. The massive emergency federal asset freeze injunctions had been officially quietly legally signed by a federal judge late Friday afternoon. The highly destructive legal trap was already completely permanently locked into place. By Monday morning, the massive national banks would legally, aggressively lock every single financial account Julian and Cynthia possessed. Tonight was absolutely their very last night of freedom, and they had absolutely zero idea that the floor beneath them had already completely violently collapsed. Suddenly, the sharp, aggressive ringing of a silver spoon, tapping loudly against a crystal champagne flute, violently cut through the loud, steady hum of the massive ballroom. The classical string quartet immediately stopped playing. The hundreds of wealthy guests slowly quieted down and aggressively turned their attention toward the front of the room. Julian confidently, proudly walked up the short carpeted steps to the elevated main stage, standing directly behind a clear acrylic podium. He grabbed the heavy microphone with a wide, bright, completely fake smile, looking out over the massive crowd of investors and high society friends. He started his speech by warmly, loudly thanking everyone for attending and for blindly believing in his massive, incredible vision. He confidently, aggressively threw out ridiculous fabricated numbers, completely lying through his teeth to the very people he was actively currently trying to rob. He bragged aggressively about his massive disruptive market strategies and his completely fake, explosive corporate growth. Then he smoothly, seamlessly shifted his aggressive tone to something sickeningly emotional and deeply entirely fabricated. He dramatically lowered his voice, leaning intimately close to the microphone, and began talking passionately about the deep, fundamental, absolute importance of strong family values. He claimed that true massive corporate success was completely, entirely meaningless unless you had a strong, highly loyal family to share the incredible, massive wealth with. He raised his hand and pointed directly at Cynthia, standing proudly in the center of the room. He called her the absolute solid rock of his entire life and the brilliant guiding architect of his massive success. The entire massive room erupted into loud, polite, wealthy applause. Cynthia pressed a delicate, manicured hand to her chest, visibly beaming with absolute, pure, incredibly arrogant pride. She actually managed to force a single, completely fake, glistening tear to slowly trail down her perfectly powdered cheek. The sheer absolute audacity of their massive public performance made the blood in my veins run completely, absolutely freezing cold. Julian waited for the loud applause to slowly die down before he turned his bright, highly predatory gaze directly toward the dark back corner of the massive ballroom where I was standing completely silently in the shadows. He told the massive crowd of millionaires that family was also absolutely about lifting each other up during the absolute darkest, most difficult times. He intentionally, carefully adopted a deeply fake, highly sorrowful expression on his handsome face. He told the massive silent crowd that his younger sister Harper had been struggling incredibly terribly lately. He actively, aggressively painted a highly pathetic, deeply humiliating public picture of me. He completely explicitly described me as a deeply financially unstable, mentally exhausted woman who had completely lost her way in the world. He said that as a highly successful, wealthy entrepreneur, he believed it was his absolute strict moral duty to generously share his massive, incredible wealth to completely help me get back on my feet. He loudly, proudly, enthusiastically announced to the entire silent ballroom that he and his loving mother were publicly presenting me with a highly generous, massive financial gift tonight to help me completely rebuild my shattered, pathetic life. He loudly, aggressively called my name directly into the heavy microphone, enthusiastically gesturing with his hand for me to come directly up to the main elevated stage to publicly accept his completely fake charity. The heavy, massive, bright white spotlight attached to the high ceiling violently suddenly swung completely across the massive dark room, completely blindingly illuminating me, standing alone in the shadows. Hundreds of wealthy, curious faces simultaneously turned to aggressively look directly at me. The crowd began to clap politely, softly, waiting expectantly for the poor, broken, pathetic sister to slowly walk up the steps and gratefully kiss the heavy gold ring of the massively successful golden boy. I stood perfectly still for one single, heavy, incredibly quiet second, staring directly into the blinding white light. I was absolutely not a broken, defeated sister. I was a senior tax auditor, completely holding a massive federal indictment in my hands. I slowly raised my chin, completely dropping the pathetic, submissive, physical posture. I began to walk forward through the massive parting crowd, heading directly straight for the brightly lit stage, perfectly, completely ready to absolutely violently burn their entire fake golden empire directly to the ground. I walked slowly and deliberately up the short carpeted steps leading to the elevated main stage. My black conservative evening gown brushed softly against the floorboards, but my heavy footsteps felt completely grounded and absolutely steady. I did not shake. I did not hesitate. As I reached the center of the brightly lit stage, Julian stepped forward to greet me. He was flashing his perfect bleached teeth for the massive crowd of wealthy investors, completely intoxicated by the sound of his own fabricated benevolence. He reached out and forcefully pulled me into a tight, aggressive, completely fake, brotherly hug. The overwhelming smell of his expensive imported cologne made my stomach physically churn. As he pressed his face roughly against my cheek, he lowered his voice to a harsh, threatening whisper meant entirely for my ears alone. He told me to smile for the cameras, take the pathetic check, and keep my mouth completely shut. He aggressively shoved a folded piece of heavy bank paper into my cold hand. It was the $20,000 cashier check my mother had promised me. The pathetic hush money meant to completely buy my permanent silence. Julian stepped back and grandly gestured toward me, presenting me to the massive ballroom like a rescued stray dog he had personally saved from the gutter. He handed me the heavy wireless microphone. The hundreds of wealthy high society guests sitting at the lavish decorated tables looked up at me with expressions of mild pity and polite boredom. They were entirely expecting me to deliver a weeping, pathetic speech expressing my profound eternal gratitude for my wealthy brother and his incredible financial generosity. They expected me to publicly validate his completely fake image as a noble, caring family man. I stood perfectly still behind the clear, acrylic presentation podium. I placed the folded cashier check deliberately onto the flat surface of the podium. I gripped the cold metal of the microphone. I looked out over the massive sea of expensive designer suits and glittering diamond necklaces. I found my mother, Cynthia, sitting at the absolute center table, front and row. And she was practically vibrating with toxic, arrogant pride, completely secure in her massive delusional victory. I took one final deep, calming breath. I leaned directly into the microphone. My voice echoed loudly and crystal clear through the massive state-of-the-art sound system, completely filling the enormous ballroom. I did not say thank you. I did not cry. I spoke with the absolute cold, calculated authority of a senior tax auditor completely commanding a hostile corporate boardroom. I told the massive crowd of investors that my brother Julian had just spoken very passionately about the profound importance of honesty, integrity, and family values. I said that as a professional forensic financial auditor, I completely agreed that transparency was the absolute fundamental cornerstone of any successful business relationship. I told them that since Julian was actively, aggressively soliciting their millions of dollars in private venture capital, tonight, I felt it was my strict professional and moral obligation to provide them with a completely accurate, highly detailed audit of his current corporate financial portfolio. Julian immediately frowned. His perfect fake smile faltered just slightly. He took a hesitant step toward the podium, clearly confused by my professional clinical tone. He reached out his hand to quietly, gently take the microphone back from me. I completely ignored him. I reached down into my small black evening clutch and pulled out the highly encrypted silver flash drive containing the massive federal whistleblower packet. The podium was equipped with a high-end presentation laptop currently displaying Julian's fake corporate logo on the massive 20-foot projector screen hanging directly behind us. I forcefully shoved the silver flash drive directly into the primary port of the laptop. I instantly bypassed his presentation software and aggressively opened my encrypted digital dossier. I clicked the presentation mode button. The massive 20-foot projector screen behind Julian violently flickered for a fraction of a second. The fake corporate logo instantly vanished. In its place, a massive high-resolution scanned image of a heavy legal document appeared. It was towering over the entire stage, impossible for anyone in the massive room to miss. I spoke clearly into the microphone, explicitly guiding the hundreds of investors through the complex financial evidence. I announced that the document displayed behind me was a legally notarized state waiver of inheritance. I explained that it explicitly permanently transferred my late father's entire $4.5 million trust fund directly into Julian's primary personal checking account. A soft murmur of slight confusion rippled through the wealthy crowd. They did not understand why I was publicly showing them my own financial surrender. I aggressively tapped the keyboard, bringing up the next slide. The screen violently, instantly transitioned. A massive, certified federal forensic handwriting analysis report completely filled the massive screen. Stamped diagonally across the forensic report, in massive glowing red digital letters, were three completely devastating words: 100% forgery. The collective sharp intake of breath from the massive ballroom sounded like a sudden, violent shift in atmospheric pressure. The wealthy investors physically sat up straight in their velvet chairs, their eyes incredibly wide with sudden, absolute shock. I clearly, calmly explained over the microphone that the highly respected federal expert who authored that specific report had completely, legally verified that my brother Julian had maliciously, criminally forged my signature and illegally bribed a corrupt state notary to completely steal my entire financial future. Julian completely froze. The color instantly violently drained from his handsome face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. He physically lunged toward the clear acrylic podium, aggressively, violently reaching for the laptop to completely tear the flash drive out of the port. I quickly, forcefully stepped directly in front of the computer, completely, physically blocking his access. I kept the heavy microphone gripped tightly in my hand, holding it firmly near my mouth so the massive crowd could hear absolutely everything. I coldly commanded him to step back immediately. The sheer, absolute, icy authority in my loud, amplified voice caused him to physically, instinctively flinch and stop dead in his tracks. Down in the front row, Cynthia had completely shot up out of her velvet chair. Her emerald silk gown rustled loudly in the sudden, deafening silence. Her mouth was hanging completely wide open in absolute, pure, unadulterated horror. Her perfect, wealthy illusion was completely, violently shattering directly in front of her most important high society friends. I did not stop. I absolutely, ruthlessly pressed the forward arrow on the keyboard. The massive projector screen behind us shifted again. This time it displayed the highly confidential Federal Uniform Commercial Code filings we had successfully stolen from the massive bank vault. I looked directly out at the terrified, wealthy investors and explicitly told them the absolute dark truth about the failing tech startup they were about to blindly fund. I announced loudly that Julian's company was currently officially $4.2 million in debt and actively bleeding massive red ink. I told him he had completely secretly secured a massive $2 million commercial federal loan just 6 weeks ago to artificially, temporarily float his fake, lavish lifestyle. I specifically directed their attention to the massive screen displaying the highly detailed collateral schedule. I pointed directly at the beautiful, elegant signature resting at the very bottom of the massive loan agreement. I explicitly, loudly informed the entire horrified ballroom that my brother did not use his own non-existent assets to secure that massive federal money. I explained that he had maliciously, completely forged the legal signature of his highly successful, brilliant African-American wife, Maya, legally, fraudulently pledging her 3 historic commercial properties to a national bank without her knowledge. The massive ballroom completely erupted. Loud, overlapping gasps of absolute pure horror and angry, disgusted whispers violently swept across the hundreds of expensive tables. These were highly sophisticated, wealthy business people. They instantly, completely recognized the absolute severe, terrifying gravity of federal wire fraud and massive bank fraud. They realized they were currently drinking expensive champagne completely funded by stolen, leveraged assets. I looked out into the chaotic crowd and found Maya. She was still sitting perfectly elegantly at her table, completely calm, her posture absolutely rigid and commanding. She was looking directly at Julian, watching him violently burn in the massive fire she helped meticulously build. Julian was breathing incredibly heavily now, his chest heaving under his expensive custom tuxedo. He was desperately aggressively looking around the massive elevated stage like a trapped, terrified animal looking for any possible exit. He was aggressively whispering threats at me, his voice completely shaking with sheer absolute panic. But I was absolutely not finished. I had one final, massive, completely lethal blow to deliver. I told the massive, shocked crowd that they were probably actively wondering where exactly all of this massive stolen capital was actually going. If the tech startup was completely bankrupt, where were the millions of dollars currently being spent? I aggressively slammed my finger down onto the keyboard for the absolute final transition. The massive screen behind Julian illuminated with a series of highly detailed, highlighted banking wire transfers. The dates and the massive dollar amounts were incredibly explicit and completely undeniable. The recipient of every single massive wire transfer was not a corporate vendor or a legitimate software developer. The recipient was a young woman named Lily. I clearly, loudly explained into the microphone that Lily was a 22-year-old former marketing intern at Julian's failing company. I read the massive explicit transaction descriptions directly of the massive glowing screen. $60,000 for a luxury imported sports car. $10,000 a month for a premium downtown penthouse apartment lease. Hundreds of thousands of dollars completely systematically funneled directly out of his stolen family trust fund and his fraudulent commercial bank loans to completely fully finance a lavish secret life for his incredibly young mistress. The absolute devastating realization hit the massive ballroom like a physical heavy bomb. The entire room completely exploded into absolute pure chaotic outrage. Wealthy older investors began aggressively, violently pushing their chairs back from the expensive tables, standing up in complete disgust. Wives were loudly, angrily whispering to their husbands, pointing aggressively directly at the stage. The absolute total destruction of Julian's carefully fabricated golden boy image was absolutely flawless and completely irreversible. He was no longer a brilliant young tech entrepreneur or a devoted, loving family man. He was completely, publicly, entirely exposed as a pathetic, massive federal criminal, a serial fraudster, a cruel, manipulative thief, and a disgusting, cheating husband. He stood completely frozen on the stage, completely paralyzed by the massive, overwhelming, crushing weight of his incredibly public total annihilation. The absolute deafening roar of the massive ballroom was completely, entirely overwhelming. The hundreds of wealthy high society guests and private venture capitalists were no longer sitting politely in their velvet chairs. They were aggressively standing up, shouting angrily and pointing directly at the massive glowing projector screen behind me. The undeniable, highly detailed financial evidence of my brother Julian completely financing a lavish secret life for his 22-year-old mistress, using their invested capital and stolen family funds, had violently shattered his entire carefully constructed golden boy illusion. Down in the front row, my mother Cynthia completely lost her mind. She violently shoved her expensive velvet chair backward, sending it crashing loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. Her emerald silk evening gown rustled aggressively as she frantically waved her arms in the air. Her face was completely twisted into a mask of pure absolute panic and vicious rage. She began loudly, aggressively screaming at the terrified hotel catering staff and the private security guards standing near the walls. She aggressively demanded that they immediately violently cut the electrical power to the main stage. She screamed for someone, anyone, to completely destroy the presentation laptop and shut down the massive glowing screen that was currently broadcasting their massive federal crimes to the entire wealthy city elite. But the hotel staff completely, absolutely froze. They were entirely paralyzed by the sheer massive scale of the high society scandal unfolding directly in front of their eyes. Nobody moved a single inch toward the electrical panels. On the elevated main stage, the absolute horrific reality of his total public destruction finally completely registered in Julian's mind. The fake brilliant entrepreneur facade violently, aggressively stripped away, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a desperate, terrified, highly aggressive, cornered animal. His handsome face flushed a dark, angry, completely violent purple. He let out a loud, guttural scream of pure, absolute rage. He violently, aggressively lunged directly across the clear acrylic podium toward me. He completely, entirely abandoned any remaining shred of human dignity. His hands curled into tight, violent fists, and he aggressively reached out to physically grab my neck to violently force me away from the live microphone. I absolutely did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground, completely firmly anchored to the stage. But before Julian could even close the short physical distance between us, a sudden, loud, incredibly sharp, highly authoritative voice violently cut through the massive chaotic noise of the crowded ballroom. It was a voice incredibly highly trained to completely dominate massive hostile federal courtrooms. It was Maya. She loudly, aggressively commanded Julian to stop moving immediately. Her loud, highly powerful voice completely paralyzed him mid-lunge. Julian aggressively snapped his head around, looking out into the massive angry crowd. The sea of wealthy, angry investors slowly, violently parted directly down the middle. Maya stepped forcefully out from the massive crowd. She was absolutely no longer playing the role of the quiet, polite, supportive corporate wife. She looked like an absolute terrifying queen of pure, absolute vengeance. She was walking with incredibly long, highly aggressive, powerful strides directly toward the elevated main stage. Her sleek silver evening gown completely caught the bright light of the crystal chandeliers, making her look absolutely brilliant and completely untouchable. But she was absolutely not walking alone. Flanking her securely on both sides were two incredibly large, heavily muscled men wearing highly conservative dark gray suits. They were not hotel security. They were highly aggressive professional private process servers, directly legally contracted by Maya's incredibly powerful corporate law firm. Maya walked directly forcefully up the short carpeted steps and stepped onto the brightly lit stage. She completely ignored me standing by the podium. Her dark, incredibly intelligent eyes were completely aggressively locked directly onto Julian. Julian physically stumbled backward, his hands dropping entirely to his sides. He looked completely, absolutely terrified of his own wife. He began frantically, aggressively stuttering, desperately trying to completely manipulate her. He frantically whispered that the massive screen was a complete lie, that I was completely crazy, and that he could entirely, completely explain everything if she just gave him 1 single minute in private. He reached out his shaking hand to gently touch her arm. Maya completely violently slapped his hand away. The sharp, loud smack echoed heavily through my live microphone, broadcasting directly to the entire silent watching ballroom. She looked him dead in the eyes with absolute, pure, cold, unadulterated hatred. She spoke with a clear, highly aggressive, totally unyielding legal authority. She explicitly told him that there was absolutely nothing left to explain. She loudly, aggressively told him that she had personally spent the last 72 hours completely reviewing every single fraudulent commercial bank loan he had maliciously forged in her name. She explicitly, loudly stated that she knew exactly how he had entirely, completely betrayed her, their marriage, and their 2 young innocent children. She quickly raised her hand. The massive private process server standing to her right immediately forcefully stepped forward. He aggressively, violently shoved a massive, thick stack of heavy legal documents directly into Julian's shaking hands. Maya loudly, completely explicitly narrated the exact contents of the thick legal packet for the entire wealthy ballroom to hear. She aggressively announced that those were highly expedited federal divorce papers, completely citing massive irreconcilable differences and extreme financial abuse. She loudly, explicitly stated that the second document was a highly restrictive, permanent emergency restraining order, completely legally barring him from coming anywhere near her, their historic commercial properties, or their 2 young children ever again. And finally, she absolutely ruthlessly delivered the massive, fatal legal blow. She loudly, aggressively announced that the third massive document was a highly aggressive, multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit, completely personally suing him for massive aggravated identity theft, extreme emotional distress, and massive financial fraud. She loudly, explicitly stated that she was legally, aggressively stripping him of absolutely every single remaining asset he thought he still completely possessed. Julian stood completely frozen, holding the massive, heavy stack of legal documents. His entire fake wealthy world was completely, entirely, violently collapsing directly on top of his head. He looked down at the divorce papers and then looked back up at Maya, his mouth completely opening and closing without a single sound coming out. He was completely, entirely, physically, emotionally, and legally destroyed. The entire massive ballroom was completely entirely dead silent, watching the absolute violent, brutal destruction of the golden boy. But the absolute true climax of the evening had not even entirely begun yet. The massive, incredibly heavy wooden double doors at the absolute far back of the massive ballroom suddenly violently, aggressively burst completely open. The heavy brass handles smashed violently, loudly against the ballroom walls. A massive, highly coordinated, highly aggressive team of men and women wearing dark, heavy tactical gear and dark windbreakers violently, aggressively flooded directly into the massive room. Printed loudly, aggressively in massive, bold yellow letters across the backs of their heavy tactical jackets were the absolute terrifying acronyms of Federal Law Enforcement, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The absolute sheer terrifying reality of the heavily armed federal agents violently storming a high society charity gala completely sent the massive wealthy crowd into absolute complete chaotic shock. Wealthy women screamed loudly, completely clutching their diamond necklaces. Wealthy older men aggressively quickly stepped backward, completely raising their empty hands into the air to absolutely explicitly show the highly armed federal agents they were completely, absolutely no threat. The lead federal agent, a tall, incredibly intensely intimidating man with short gray hair and a highly aggressive tactical presence, raised his hand and loudly aggressively commanded the entire massive room to completely entirely freeze. His highly trained booming voice completely utterly dominated the massive space. He aggressively loudly announced that this was a highly official federal law enforcement raid. A heavily armed tactical squad of 6 highly aggressive federal agents rapidly, violently, completely pushed their way directly through the massive, terrified crowd. They marched with incredible, aggressive, terrifying purpose directly straight toward the elevated main stage. Their heavy tactical boots pounded violently, loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Julian watched them rapidly approaching, his entire body violently, completely shaking. He dropped the massive stack of Maya's legal documents entirely onto the stage floor. The heavy federal agents aggressively, forcefully bounded completely up the short carpeted stairs and instantly, violently, completely surrounded him. The lead federal agent aggressively, roughly grabbed Julian by his expensive, custom-tailored shoulder and violently, forcefully spun him entirely around. He loudly, aggressively informed Julian that he was officially completely under federal arrest for massive, multi-million-dollar wire fraud, extreme aggravated identity theft, and massive federal tax evasion. Before Julian could even utter a single pathetic syllable of protest, the heavy, cold steel handcuffs were violently, aggressively slapped directly onto his wrists. The loud, sharp, metallic clicking sound of the federal handcuffs ratcheting completely tight echoed perfectly clearly through the entire massive ballroom. Julian completely, entirely physically collapsed, sobbing loudly, pathetically, completely burying his handsome face entirely into his chest. He was completely, absolutely, thoroughly destroyed in front of every single wealthy person he ever desperately tried to impress. Suddenly, a massive, loud, highly frantic screaming completely broke through the heavy, intense federal operation. It was Cynthia. My mother was completely, aggressively, forcefully pushing her way through the massive crowd of terrified, wealthy investors, violently, aggressively shoving people entirely out of her way. Her expensive emerald silk gown was completely torn at the bottom hem, but she absolutely did not care. She completely, actively, violently rushed the front of the main stage, entirely, completely blinded by her massive, toxic, arrogant delusion. She completely honestly believed she could still magically, aggressively manipulate the massive federal justice system exactly the way she manipulated our entire family. She violently, aggressively pointed her perfectly manicured finger directly at the heavily armed federal agents currently physically holding her weeping, handcuffed son. She screamed loudly, completely aggressively at the top of her lungs, completely demanding that they immediately, completely release him. The lead federal agent completely, calmly, explicitly warned her to immediately, strictly step back or face massive federal obstruction charges. But Cynthia was completely, entirely too far gone in her massive, toxic, narcissistic rage to properly, completely understand the absolute terrifying reality of the massive situation. She ran directly, completely up to the clear acrylic podium, standing exactly right next to the highly sensitive live microphone that was still completely actively, aggressively broadcasting every single word directly to the entire massive room and highly crucially directly into the digital recording devices attached to the federal agents' tactical vests. She screamed loudly, aggressively that Julian absolutely did not do anything completely wrong. She violently, aggressively pointed directly at me, entirely explicitly screaming that I was the one who was completely, totally crazy. She loudly, forcefully, explicitly screamed into the live microphone that the massive millions of dollars in the family trust fund completely, entirely, rightfully belonged to her. And then my mother made the single most completely devastating, legally fatal, completely idiotic, massive mistake of her entire pathetic, arrogant life. In her absolute frantic, highly aggressive, desperate, completely toxic attempt to completely, legally, completely clear her golden boy son of the massive forgery and the massive theft, she loudly, forcefully, completely, explicitly confessed her absolute, entirely willing, total participation in the massive federal crime directly onto a highly sensitive live microphone, completely surrounded by dozens of highly trained federal investigators. She screamed loudly, aggressively that Julian absolutely, completely, entirely had her highly explicit, absolute, total permission to completely securely move that $4.5 million. She loudly, aggressively, entirely explicitly shouted that she personally, completely, legally, totally authorized him to hire the state notary to completely, entirely, totally remove my legal name from the family trust fund because I completely, absolutely, entirely did not deserve a single penny of my father's money. The entire massive ballroom completely, utterly, entirely gasped in absolute, pure, massive collective horror. The lead federal agent completely, slowly, deliberately turned his head to completely, squarely look directly at Cynthia. He had absolutely, totally, completely, entirely, just legally captured a highly massive voluntary, spontaneous, explicit, total audio confession to massive federal criminal conspiracy to commit massive wire fraud and massive federal identity theft directly from her own arrogant mouth. He completely, slowly, entirely deliberately unclipped a second pair of heavy steel federal handcuffs directly from his heavy tactical belt. He completely, entirely, explicitly, calmly informed my mother, Cynthia, that she was completely, entirely, officially under federal arrest for massive, direct, active participation in a highly complex, massive federal criminal conspiracy. He aggressively, forcefully, entirely, totally grabbed her wrists, completely, violently, entirely twisting them behind her back. Cynthia completely, utterly, absolutely, entirely shrieked in absolute, pure, massive, total, complete horror. She screamed loudly, completely, entirely, desperately for Julian, completely, totally demanding that he absolutely, actively, legally, completely, entirely stop them. But Julian was completely, entirely, already actively, aggressively, forcefully being violently, entirely, totally marched directly off the main stage, completely surrounded by heavily armed federal agents, completely, entirely crying pathetically like a completely, totally, absolutely, entirely broken child. The incredibly massive, highly destructive machinery of the massive federal justice system completely, utterly, entirely, violently swallowed them both completely, entirely, absolutely, completely whole. Maya and I stood perfectly, completely, entirely, absolutely still on the massive elevated stage, watching the heavy federal agents completely, entirely, actively, aggressively, completely, forcefully drag my mother and my brother completely, entirely, totally, absolutely, entirely out of the massive, gorgeous, completely silent, wealthy ballroom. The incredible, heavy, overwhelming, completely toxic, crushing weight that I had actively, completely, entirely carried on my shoulders for my entire, absolute whole life was completely, absolutely, entirely, totally, utterly, instantly, entirely, completely, totally gone. I took a massive, deep, completely full breath of the completely clean, cold air. We had completely, entirely, absolutely, totally won. Exactly 1 entire month had completely passed since the massive federal raid violently, aggressively shattered the lavish charity gala and completely, permanently destroyed my toxic family. The absolute total destruction of my brother Julian was incredibly swift and entirely merciless. The massive, incredibly heavy federal justice system absolutely does not play games when it comes to massive complex wire fraud and severe aggravated identity theft. Julian was officially completely denied federal bail because the presiding federal judge correctly deemed him an extreme aggressive flight risk due to his massive hidden offshore accounts. He was currently sitting completely alone in a cold, damp, concrete federal detention center, aggressively facing a massive mandatory minimum sentence of 10 solid years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His incredibly expensive custom-tailored designer suits were permanently, entirely traded for a standard-issue bright orange federal jumpsuit. The massive fake tech startup he had desperately aggressively tried to build on a massive foundation of complete lies formally completely dissolved within exactly 48 hours of his very public high society federal arrest. The massive national commercial bank immediately aggressively executed the extreme emergency guarantor clauses legally attached to his massive fraudulent loans. But because Maya had flawlessly, legally, successfully filed the extreme emergency federal injunctions proving the massive severe identity theft before the bank could officially act, her 3 historic commercial properties were completely legally protected and entirely completely safe. Maya had flawlessly, legally, entirely insulated herself and her 2 young, beautiful children from his massive, catastrophic financial blast radius. She officially, entirely, completely divorced him, completely legally, stripping him of absolutely every single remaining parental right. Julian was completely, entirely, utterly alone, facing the massive, crushing, incredibly heavy weight of the United States federal government without a completely single dollar to his absolute pathetic name. But the most incredibly satisfying, absolute total financial destruction belonged entirely completely to my mother, Cynthia. Her massive, arrogant, completely toxic delusion had finally, completely, fatally, utterly betrayed her. That highly aggressive, spontaneous, loud, screaming confession she voluntarily, explicitly delivered directly into my live microphone had been perfectly, cleanly, flawlessly recorded by dozens of highly sensitive federal tactical audio devices. She had completely legally, entirely explicitly confessed to massive criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and completely aiding and abetting massive federal tax evasion. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division completely, ruthlessly, aggressively seized every single financial asset she currently legally possessed to aggressively, completely, absolutely pay off the massive, staggering federal tax penalties Julian had aggressively accumulated over the past 3 years. Because she had explicitly, legally, loudly admitted to actively, willingly participating in the massive criminal theft of my $4.5 million trust fund, the federal government immediately, aggressively, completely, officially seized her massive, pristine, expensive suburban mansion. The very same incredibly expensive, sprawling, beautiful house she had so proudly, arrogantly, aggressively kicked me out of just weeks prior was now officially, heavily, entirely padlocked and completely owned by the federal government. All of her massive, expensive, brilliant diamond jewelry, her luxury imported vehicles, and her massive, lucrative retirement accounts were completely, entirely, legally liquidated by the highly aggressive federal authorities to officially legally pay the massive, heavy legal financial restitution she severely, absolutely owed me. She went from being a highly wealthy, arrogant, powerful, high society widow to an absolutely, entirely, completely destitute criminal suspect waiting for her massive federal trial in less than exactly 30 days. Her massive, wealthy circle of high society friends completely, entirely, totally abandoned her. The exact second the massive federal indictment hit the local news violently, completely shutting her directly out of the exclusive country club forever. It was incredibly late on a freezing, bitterly cold Tuesday evening when the aggressive, harsh, loud buzzing of my secure, modern apartment intercom violently interrupted the quiet, peaceful silence of my warm living room. I was sitting completely comfortably on my soft, expensive couch, drinking a hot, steaming cup of tea, completely enjoying the incredibly profound, absolute safe silence of my brand new independent life. I completely, slowly, calmly, deliberately walked over to the digital security monitor, securely mounted directly on the wall next to my heavy locked front door. I pressed the bright illuminated green button to immediately activate the live exterior high-definition video camera feed. The bright color video feed flickered slightly and then completely clearly displayed the cold, dark, freezing, brightly lit entrance of my highly secure apartment building. Standing completely, entirely alone, shivering violently, aggressively in the freezing, brutal, aggressive Chicago winter wind was my mother. Cynthia looked absolutely, entirely, completely, totally unrecognizable. The stunning, expensive emerald silk evening gowns and the massive, brilliant diamonds were completely, entirely, permanently gone. She was wearing a dirty, heavily stained, incredibly oversized, cheap winter coat that looked exactly like it had been hastily, quickly, desperately pulled directly out of a cheap public donation bin. Her perfectly styled, expensive hair was heavily, severely matted and completely, entirely wet from the freezing, icy rain aggressively falling heavily outside the glass doors. She was absolutely not holding expensive designer leather handbags. She was physically, aggressively, desperately clutching two massive cheap black plastic trash bags, tightly filled with whatever pathetic small random clothing items she had hastily, aggressively managed to grab before the heavily armed federal agents completely, permanently, officially locked her directly out of her massive, beautiful mansion forever. She looked completely, entirely, absolutely, totally pathetic, standing there in the freezing, brutal rain. She aggressively pushed the small glowing intercom button again, her bare hands visibly, violently, heavily shaking from the extreme, bitter, brutal cold. I slowly, completely, deliberately pressed the two-way audio connect button, allowing her pathetic, broken voice to completely, directly filter into my warm, incredibly safe apartment. Her voice was completely, heavily, utterly broken, and she was aggressively, violently, loudly sobbing directly into the small metal speaker. She cried loudly, completely, desperately, begging me to please quickly, immediately let her safely inside the warm building. She frantically, aggressively pleaded that she was completely, entirely, totally freezing to death and had absolutely, literally nowhere else in the entire world to safely go. She loudly, aggressively, completely cried that all of her wealthy high society friends had completely, entirely, totally blocked her phone calls and absolutely, completely refused to open their massive heavy doors for a known federal criminal. She aggressively, violently begged for my immediate forgiveness, loudly, pathetically calling me her beautiful, smart, absolutely wonderful, loyal daughter. She completely, desperately asked me to simply, quickly, please open the heavy security door and just gently give her a warm, safe place to sleep for the night. She completely promised me she would absolutely, entirely clean my apartment and completely, entirely cook my meals if I just completely, kindly let her safely stay with me. I stood perfectly, completely, absolutely, entirely still, inside my warm, incredibly safe, quiet living room, staring directly, intensely at her pathetic, completely broken, desperate image on the bright, glowing digital screen. I completely, absolutely felt absolutely zero tiny ounce of pity. I completely, entirely felt absolutely zero, completely residual family guilt. I had spent my entire adult life completely sacrificing my own massive financial security to desperately, completely try to earn her toxic conditional love, and she had actively, willingly, completely tried to destroy my entire absolute future. I slowly, deliberately leaned directly, incredibly close to the small sensitive microphone securely mounted on the wall. I made absolutely, completely, entirely sure my voice was completely, incredibly, completely calm, totally, completely icy, and absolutely, completely, totally devoid of any human emotion whatsoever. I completely, explicitly wanted her to hear the absolute, total, terrifying finality in my incredibly steady voice. I spoke clearly, deliberately, directly into the live intercom, entirely, completely, explicitly, telling her that Parasites cannot afford to host guests, Mom. I stood completely, absolutely still and actively watched the glowing digital security screen as the absolute crushing, massive, heavy, incredibly brutal reality of my incredibly cold exact words completely, entirely, violently, physically hit her. Her heavily crying eyes widened in absolute, completely, totally pure, massive horror as she instantly, completely, perfectly recognized the exact, completely toxic, vicious, horrible insult she had completely, arrogantly, violently hurled directly at my face just one short, incredibly long month ago. She completely, absolutely, finally realized in that exact terrifying, incredibly heavy, brutal moment that I was completely, entirely, totally, absolutely never going to save her from the massive federal destruction she completely, actively created. I slowly, completely, deliberately reached out my hand and firmly, aggressively pressed the heavy red security lockout button entirely, explicitly, permanently, entirely, blocking her specific unique entry code from the entire building security system. I quickly, completely, aggressively, entirely turned the entire video security monitor completely, entirely off, violently, instantly plunging the small digital screen into absolute, total, complete dark blackness. I slowly, calmly, completely, deliberately walked directly, entirely back to my soft, comfortable, warm couch, completely, gracefully picking up my warm, steaming cup of tea. I absolutely, completely did not look completely out the large glass window. I completely, entirely, absolutely did not care where she completely, entirely eventually went in the freezing, brutal winter rain. The massive, incredibly heavy, completely toxic, absolutely, entirely violent chapter of my entire, absolute whole life was officially, totally, completely, permanently, completely, entirely closed. The legal aftermath of my mother and brother's federal arrests took several intense months to completely untangle. But the federal justice system moves with incredible precision when it has an airtight financial map. Because the evidence of the forgery was absolutely undeniable, and my mother had explicitly confessed on a federal audio recording, the probate courts completely reversed the fraudulent inheritance waiver. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when I finally logged into my secure banking portal and saw the correct numbers officially reflecting on the bright screen. $4.5 million. My late father's hard-earned legacy was finally entirely safely restored to its rightful owner. I stared at the massive number for a very long time, but I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming rush of greedy joy that my brother Julian would have felt. Instead, I felt a profound sense of absolute quiet peace. This money was no longer just a financial safety net. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof that I had successfully survived the absolute worst betrayal of my entire life and emerged completely victorious. I immediately closed the banking portal and drafted a highly concise formal resignation letter to the senior partners at my corporate auditing firm. I had spent my entire adult career completely exhausting myself to protect the massive wealth of faceless corporate billionaires. I was absolutely entirely done using my brilliant forensic accounting skills to simply make rich people slightly richer. I had discovered my true absolute purpose in the freezing dark shadows of an underground parking garage, and I was fully prepared to build an entire new life around it. I used a portion of my restored inheritance to legally, officially launch my very own private forensic accounting agency. I completely dedicated the entire mission of my new firm to specifically helping vulnerable women uncover hidden assets and massive financial abuse within their toxic marriages. Every single day, thousands of brilliant, capable women are systematically manipulated, completely lied to, and financially isolated by the exact same kind of narcissistic predators as my brother Julian. They are told they do not understand complex finances. They are aggressively gaslit into completely signing away their legal rights. I wanted to be the absolute terrifying financial weapon those women could confidently hire to completely level the unfair playing field. I wanted to systematically, ruthlessly tear apart the fraudulent tax returns and the hidden offshore accounts of their abusive husbands, exactly like I had done to my own toxic family. But I knew absolutely perfectly well that I could not possibly fight these massive high-stakes legal wars completely alone. I needed an absolute legal powerhouse to seamlessly translate my complex forensic financial evidence into devastating federal court victories. There was only one single woman in the entire city of Chicago who completely possessed the exact fierce, unyielding legal brilliance I desperately needed. Maya had spent the last several months completely, utterly dominating her own incredibly complex personal legal battles. The highly aggressive federal bank fraud charges against my brother provided her with absolute flawless legal leverage in family court. The presiding family court judge took one single look at Julian's massive active federal indictment and immediately, completely, permanently stripped him of all legal and physical custody rights. Maya secured absolute full permanent custody of her two beautiful young children, completely insulating their bright futures from the massive toxic stain of their father's federal crimes. Furthermore, because she had successfully aggressively proven the massive identity theft, her three historic commercial properties remained entirely perfectly, completely untouched by the aggressive banking institutions. She had successfully completely defended her entire hard-earned net worth against a massive coordinated federal financial attack. When I formally approached her with the official business plan for the new forensic accounting agency, she did not even hesitate for a single second. She completely officially resigned her highly lucrative senior partnership at her massive corporate law firm to become the primary lead legal counsel and absolute equal co-founder of our brand new agency. We officially completely opened our new corporate doors on a beautiful, bright, sunny Monday morning in late spring. We deliberately, intentionally chose a massive, beautiful office space located right in the heart of the downtown Chicago financial district. The previous few months had been entirely completely defined by cold, dark, freezing parking garages, cheap, sterile hotel rooms, and the heavy, suffocating shadows of a massive federal criminal conspiracy. We actively, completely wanted our brand new space to reflect the absolute total opposite of that dark, toxic energy. Our massive corner office featured towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows that completely allowed the bright, warm, golden morning sunlight to completely, entirely flood the massive, beautiful room. The walls were painted a crisp, clean, calming white, and the expensive modern furniture was designed to make our traumatized clients feel completely, entirely safe and fiercely protected the exact second they walked through our heavy glass doors. I stood perfectly quietly near the massive glass window, looking directly down at the busy, bustling city streets far below. The heavy, dark, freezing, brutal winter had completely, finally, entirely faded away, leaving behind a bright, warm, highly promising spring. I heard the soft, familiar click of high heels completely crossing the polished hardwood floor behind me. Maya walked smoothly up to the massive window, standing perfectly shoulder to shoulder right beside me. She was wearing a stunning, flawless, pristine white tailored designer suit, looking absolutely incredibly powerful, radiant, and completely, entirely free. She was no longer carrying the massive, heavy, crushing burden of a toxic, lying husband. She handed me a warm ceramic mug of fresh, hot black coffee. We stood completely, entirely, silently together for a few long, peaceful moments, completely, simply basking in the warm, golden sunlight, completely warming our faces. We did not need to say anything about the absolute total ruin of the toxic people who had so aggressively, violently tried to destroy us. We completely raised our warm coffee mugs and gently clinked the thick ceramic together. The soft, satisfying sound completely echoed clearly in the bright, warm, sunlit room. It was an absolute, quiet, profound toast to our completely flawless victory, to the incredible, powerful, unbreakable sisterhood we had forged in the absolute darkest fires, and to the bright, beautiful, entirely unwritten future, completely resting perfectly safely in our own hands. I want to take a moment to talk directly to anyone listening right now who might be standing in the middle of their own dark storm. For so many years, I genuinely thought being a good daughter meant constantly sacrificing my own financial security to keep my mother and my brother comfortably afloat. I deeply confused financial exploitation with basic family duty. Society teaches us from a very young age that blood relations are absolutely everything, and that we inherently owe our families our endless unconditional loyalty, no matter how terribly they treat us behind closed doors. But I am here to tell you right now with absolute certainty that loyalty should never ever cost you your sanity, your inner peace, or your hard-earned future. Family is supposed to be your safe harbor, not the violent storm that completely sinks you. Never let anyone leverage your natural empathy or your familial guilt to secretly steal your future. If someone constantly demands your money, your valuable time, and your emotional energy, but cruelly calls you a parasite the absolute second you firmly establish a boundary, they absolutely do not love you. They are simply aggressively using you for their own selfish gain. Financial abuse within families is incredibly common, and it almost always hides perfectly behind the manipulative mask of duty and obligation. They will aggressively call you selfish for finally loudly saying no. They will viciously call you crazy for simply noticing their obvious lies. Do not ever listen to them. You have every single fundamental right to permanently walk away from a table where basic human respect is no longer being served, even if you have been loyally sitting at that exact same table your entire life. It is incredibly profoundly painful to finally realize that the very people who were supposed to protect you are actually the exact predators you need to be fiercely protected from. But the beautiful truth is that the exact moment you finally stop shrinking yourself to perfectly fit into their toxic fabricated narrative is the exact moment your real beautiful life actually begins. You absolutely do not need their conditional validation to be incredibly successful, and you absolutely do not need their permission to be completely happy. If you have ever had to bravely, fiercely stand up for yourself against the very people who should have protected you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Leave a comment below telling me exactly what city you are watching from and what time it is there. I truly want to know exactly where all my incredibly strong, resilient women are at today. We are actively building a powerful, supportive community of survivors here. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. Remember, you completely hold the pen to your own story. See you in the next video.